Welcome, weary traveller, to a tale of wisdom shadowed by folly, of brilliance dimmed by devastating choices. Tonight, we explore not the legend of Albus Dumbledore the Great, but the man beneath the half-moon spectacles, a soul whose pursuit of the greater good carved a path through darkness that would cost him everything he held dear. As you settle into the comfort of sleep, let these words carry you through the hidden corridors of regret, where even the greatest wizard of his age discovered that good intentions, however pure, cannot shield us from the terrible weight of our mistakes. Welcome to the quiet chambers of regret, where even the greatest among us discover that wisdom earned too late carries the heaviest weight of all. Tonight, we delve into the shadows that shaped Albus Dumbledore's soul, beginning with a summer that would forever alter the trajectory of a brilliant young wizard's life. As you settle into the embrace of sleep, let these words carry you through the corridors of memory, where duty and sacrifice first learned to walk hand in hand, leaving footprints that would echo through decades of impossible choices. The summer of 1899 dawned with the promise that only youth can feel, when the world stretches endlessly ahead and every dream seems within reach. Albus Dumbledore, barely 18, and already recognized as the most brilliant student Hogwarts had produced in generations, stood poised on the threshold of a future that glittered with unlimited possibility. His academic achievements had been unprecedented, his magical innovations revolutionary, his professors unanimous in their belief that here was a wizard destined to reshape the magical world through pure intellectual brilliance. But fate, that most capricious of forces, had different plans for the young prodigy whose name was already whispered in the hallowed halls of the ministry and the academic circles of magical Europe. The letter that arrived on a rain-soaked July morning carried news that would shatter every carefully constructed plan, every ambitious dream, every assumption about the path his life would take. Kendra Dumbledore, his mother, was dead. The circumstances of her death were as tragic as they were inevitable, given the delicate balance their family had maintained for so many years. Ariana Dumbledore, his younger sister, had been damaged beyond repair by a brutal attack from Muggle boys who had witnessed her performing accidental magic at the age of 6. The trauma had left her magical core fractured, her abilities wild and uncontrollable, prone to explosive outbursts that could level buildings and kill anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby when her power erupted without warning or restraint. For years, Kendra had devoted her life entirely to caring for Ariana, creating a fortress of love and protection around her damaged daughter, while sacrificing every other aspect of her existence. She had moved the family to Godric's Hollow, away from the whispers and stares that followed families touched by such tragedy. She had isolated herself from the magical community, becoming a ghost who lived only for the moments when Ariana was calm and peaceful, when the broken girl could almost remember what it felt like to be whole. But magic, when damaged beyond certain limits, becomes as unpredictable as wildfire in a drought-stricken forest. No amount of love or vigilance could entirely contain the forces that raged within Ariana's fractured soul. And on that terrible July morning, something went catastrophically wrong. The explosion of uncontrolled magic that claimed Kendra's life was instantaneous and absolute, leaving behind only the devastating silence that follows when the unthinkable becomes reality. Albus received the news while sitting in his rooms at Hogwarts, surrounded by books that detailed the advanced magical theories he had been exploring in preparation for his planned European tour with Professor Dippet. He had been accepted into the most prestigious academic circles, invited to contribute to research that could revolutionize understanding of transfiguration and charms work. Publishers were competing for the rights to his theoretical papers, and several magical institutions had already extended offers for positions that would have established him as one of the youngest professors in wizarding history. All of these opportunities evaporated the moment he read his brother Aberforth's tersely worded telegram announcing their mother's death and demanding his immediate return home. The future that had stretched before him like an endless horizon suddenly contracted to the size of a cottage in Godric's Hollow, where a damaged sister needed constant care and a younger brother's accusing eyes reminded him daily of the price that duty demanded from those born into families where tragedy had taken up permanent residence. The journey home felt like traveling backward through time, each mile carrying him further from the man he had planned to become and closer to a role he had never wanted but could not refuse. The academic robes that had marked him as Hogwarts' most promising graduate felt like costume pieces from a play that had ended abruptly, leaving the actors to find their way off stage in confusion and disappointment. The books that had been his companions, filled with theories and possibilities that had once excited him beyond measure, now seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. Aberforth met him at the cottage door with an expression that mixed grief and anger in equal measure, his younger brother's face already showing the hard lines that came from shouldering responsibilities too heavy for someone barely 16. The accusation in his eyes was clear, even if unspoken. Where were you when she needed you? Why weren't you here to help carry this burden? How could you pursue your dreams while she sacrificed everything for our sister's needs? The cottage itself had become a prison disguised as a home, its rooms rearranged to accommodate the needs of someone whose magical outbursts could destroy furniture and crack foundations without warning. Protective charms layered the walls so thickly that the air itself felt heavy with suppressed energy, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously secure and suffocating. Every surface bore the scars of previous incidents, scorch marks on stone, twisted metal where frames had been warped by magical pressure, carefully patched holes where explosive force had found weak points in their defenses. Ariana sat in the parlor when Albus first saw her after his mother's death, a young woman of 17 whose physical beauty couldn't disguise the fundamental brokenness that radiated from her like heat from a forge. Her eyes, which should have sparkled with intelligence and life, held the distant quality of someone whose mind spent most of its time in places that normal consciousness couldn't reach. When she looked at him, there were moments of recognition that flickered like candle flames in a draught, brief returns to lucidity that only emphasized how far she had traveled from the girl she should have been. The weight of responsibility that settled on Albus's shoulders that first evening was unlike anything his academic achievements had prepared him to bear. This wasn't a problem that could be solved through research and experimentation, not a theoretical challenge that yielded to intellectual analysis and creative thinking. This was the raw, grinding reality of caring for someone whose needs were infinite and whose condition would never improve, only fluctuate between bad and catastrophic, depending on factors that seemed to follow no pattern he could discern. His correspondence with the academic institutions that had been courting his talents became an exercise in progressive disappointment, each letter explaining another delay, another postponement, another reason why he couldn't accept their generous offers. Professor Dippet wrote repeatedly, urging him to reconsider, to find alternative arrangements for his family situation that would allow him to pursue the career that his abilities demanded. Other professors and researchers added their voices, insisting that the magical world needed minds like his engaged in advancing knowledge rather than wasted on domestic responsibilities that others could surely handle. But Albus understood something that his well-meaning advisors couldn't grasp. There were no others who could handle this situation. Ariana's condition was too dangerous for ordinary caregivers. too complex for institutional care, too volatile for anyone without the magical skills necessary to contain her outbursts and protect both her and the surrounding community from the consequences of her fractured abilities. The specialized healers at Street Mungo's had made their assessment clear. She was beyond their help, a case too severe for their methods, a tragedy that could only be managed, never cured. Aberforth's resentment grew more bitter with each passing week. His anger focused not on their tragic circumstances, but on what he perceived as Albus's reluctance to fully embrace their new reality. While Albus still spent hours each day reading, still maintained correspondence with magical theorists, still worked on research projects that kept one foot in the academic world he had lost, Aberforth threw himself completely into caring for Ariana, with a devotion that bordered on self-destruction. The contrast between the brothers became more pronounced as autumn turned to winter, and the reality of their situation settled over them like a permanent fog. Aberforth had always been more practical than theoretical, more interested in the immediate and tangible than the abstract and possible. For him, caring for Ariana was a straightforward matter of duty and love, requiring no complex analysis or intellectual framework. She was their sister, she needed them, therefore they would care for her until the end of their lives if necessary. Albus's approach was inevitably more complicated, shadowed by the understanding that every day spent in Godric's Hollow was a day stolen from the work that his mind was designed to accomplish. He couldn't help but calculate the cost, not just to himself, but to the magical world that would be deprived of whatever discoveries and innovations he might have contributed if circumstances had been different. The guilt of such thoughts warred constantly with the guilt of considering his own desires when his sister's needs were so immediate and overwhelming. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of their new life, as the Dumbledore cottage became an island cut off from normal social intercourse by the necessities of Ariana's condition. They couldn't invite friends or colleagues to visit, couldn't leave her alone long enough to maintain relationships outside their immediate family, couldn't participate in the community activities that provided normal families with social connections and emotional support. The magical world continued to function and evolve around them while they remained trapped in a bubble of perpetual crisis management. Winter brought its own challenges, as Ariana's condition seemed to worsen in response to the seasonal changes, her outbursts becoming more frequent and more violent as the days grew shorter and the magical energy that surrounded them became more compressed and volatile. The protective charms required constant maintenance and regular renewal, work that fell primarily to Albus since his magical abilities were more sophisticated than his brothers, adding another layer of responsibility to days that already stretched the limits of physical and emotional endurance. The letters from his former professors and potential employers gradually decreased in frequency, as it became clear that whatever delays Albus faced were not temporary inconveniences but permanent changes to his life trajectory. Some wrote with genuine sympathy and understanding, expressing hope that circumstances might eventually change to allow him to return to academic pursuits. Others were more businesslike in their disappointment, professional relationships that withered when it became clear that the brilliant young wizard they had hoped to mentor was no longer available for the future they had imagined together. But perhaps the most painful correspondence came from former classmates who had moved on to the careers and opportunities that should have been his as well. Their letters filled with descriptions of exciting research projects, international collaborations, and breakthrough discoveries that highlighted everything he was missing while trapped in domestic obligations that seemed to stretch endlessly into a future that offered no hope of change or improvement. The spring of 1900 brought a brief period of hope when Ariana experienced several weeks of unusual stability, her magical outbursts becoming less frequent and less destructive, allowing the family to imagine that perhaps some kind of recovery might be possible. During these calm interludes, glimpses of the intelligent, creative young woman she might have been shone through the damage that normally obscured her personality, creating moments of connection that reminded them why their sacrifices were meaningful even when they felt unbearable. But Hope, in the Dumbledore household, had learned to wear the mask of tragedy, and these periods of improvement inevitably preceded crashes that were more severe than anything that had come before, as if Ariana's magical core was gathering strength during the calm periods, only to release it in explosive bursts that left their protective measures in ruins and their emotional resources depleted beyond recovery. It was during one such period of false hope that Albus made what he would later recognize as one of the defining decisions of his life. He began to develop a philosophical framework that would allow him to find meaning in sacrifice, to transform personal loss into something that served a larger purpose. The concept that would later become his guiding principle of the greater good began to take shape during those long nights when he sat beside Ariana's bed, watching her sleep and trying to understand how individual suffering could be justified when weighed against collective benefit. The intellectual exercise became an emotional necessity as the months stretched into years, and the reality of his situation settled into permanent fact rather than temporary crisis. If he was going to survive psychologically, he needed to believe that his sacrifice served some higher purpose, that the brilliant academic career he had abandoned was less important than the love and protection he provided to someone who couldn't protect herself. But the framework he constructed was fragile, dependent on assumptions about duty and morality that would be tested repeatedly throughout his life, refined through experiences that would challenge every comfortable certainty he tried to establish about the relationship between individual needs and collective welfare. The young man who learned to find meaning in unwanted sacrifice was laying the intellectual groundwork for the older man who would make decisions that would horrify his younger self, choices that could only be justified through the same utilitarian mathematics he was developing during those isolated years in Godric's Hollow. The pattern that emerged during this period would define every major decision of his later life. The tendency to shoulder impossible burdens alone, the assumption that his superior intellect qualified him to make choices about other people's welfare, the willingness to sacrifice personal relationships for what he perceived as higher purposes, the isolation that circumstances forced upon him, became a habit of mind that persisted long after the original reasons for solitude had passed, creating the emotional distance that would allow him to manipulate and sacrifice others with the same cool calculation he had learned to apply to his own thwarted ambitions. Aberforth watched these changes in his older brother with growing alarm, recognizing that Albus was becoming someone fundamentally different from the idealistic young scholar who had returned home to fulfill family obligations. The warmth and spontaneous affection that had characterized their relationship during childhood were being replaced by a kind of analytical distance, as if Albus was studying their family situation rather than simply living it, looking for patterns and principles that could be extracted and applied to other circumstances. The brothers' relationship became increasingly strained as their different approaches to caring for Ariana created philosophical conflicts that neither could resolve through rational discussion. Aberforth's approach remained fundamentally emotional. Ariana was their sister, they loved her. Therefore, they would protect and care for her regardless of personal cost. Albus's approach was becoming increasingly intellectual. Their situation was tragic, but not unique. Their sacrifice was meaningful because it demonstrated principles about duty and love that had broader applications to human welfare and social organization. These philosophical differences might have remained merely theoretical, if not for the arrival, in the summer of 1901, of a visitor whose brilliant mind and charismatic personality would tempt Albus to abandon everything he had learned about duty and sacrifice in pursuit of dreams that promised to transform not just his own life, but the entire structure, wizarding society. Gellert Grindelwald's arrival in Godric's Hollow would test every principle that Albus had developed during his years of enforced domesticity, challenging him to choose between the love that had sustained him and the ambition that had never truly died, despite years of suppression. But that temptation lay in the future, and for now, the young Albus Dumbledore continued his patient vigil beside a sister whose broken mind held the key to understanding how love and duty could coexist with ambition and intellectual pride, how individual sacrifice could serve purposes larger than personal satisfaction, and how the greatest wizards were often shaped not by their triumphs, but by the burdens they chose to bear in silence and solitude. The summer of 1899 had taught Albus Dumbledore the bitter arithmetic of sacrifice, the way dreams could be weighed against duty and found wanting when measured on the scales of family obligation. 2 years had passed since his mother's death trapped him in a prison of love and responsibility. 2 years of watching his brilliant mind grow restless within the confines of domestic necessity, while his damaged sister required constant vigilance, and his younger brother's accusing eyes reminded him daily of the price that heroism demanded from those born into tragedy. But fate, that most persistent of architects, was not finished reshaping the foundations of his life. The knock that came at the cottage door on a blazing July afternoon would introduce forces into his carefully ordered world of sacrifice that would test every principle he had constructed during his years of enforced solitude. The young man who stood on the threshold, his golden hair catching the summer light like spun sunbeams, and his mismatched eyes holding depths of intelligence that matched Albus's own, would prove to be either salvation or damnation, depending on how history chose to judge the choices that followed their first electrifying encounter. Gellert Grindelwald arrived in Godric's Hollow with the casual arrogance of someone who had never doubted his own exceptional nature, carrying himself with the unconscious grace of a predator who knew that the world would reshape itself to accommodate his desires. His great-aunt Bathilda Bagshot had mentioned her visiting grandnephew only in passing, describing him as a brilliant young wizard who had been expelled from Durmstrang for conducting magical experiments that pushed beyond the boundaries of what even that liberal institution considered acceptable. The casual way she mentioned his disgrace should have served as warning, but Albus heard only the promise of intellectual companionship after years of isolation that had starved his mind of the stimulation it craved. Their first meeting occurred by apparent accident when Albus encountered Gellert walking through the village lanes with the confident stride of someone exploring territory he intended to claim. The conversation that sparked between them was immediate and electric. Two brilliant minds recognizing in each other the intellectual equal that neither had expected to find in such provincial surroundings. Within minutes of introduction, they were deep in theoretical discussions that ranged across subjects that most wizards would have found incomprehensible, their voices rising with excitement as they discovered the exhilarating pleasure of being understood by someone whose intelligence could match their own. Gellert's knowledge was vast and unconventional, shaped by educational experiences that had exposed him to magical traditions that British wizards typically ignored or actively suppressed. His years at Durmstrang had given him access to dark arts instruction that Hogwarts would never have permitted, while his travels across magical Europe had exposed him to philosophical traditions that challenged every comfortable assumption about the proper relationship between magical and non-magical peoples. When he spoke about the artificial limitations that wizarding society imposed upon itself, the voluntary subjugation to inferior beings who couldn't even perceive the forces that shaped their world, his words resonated with frustrations that Albus had been suppressing for years. The attraction between them developed with the inevitable force of magical resonance. Two powerful wizards, whose abilities amplified each other's strengths, while their personalities complemented each other's weaknesses. Albus had always been cautious, analytical, prone to considering every angle before committing to action. Gellert was intuitive, decisive, willing to pursue his convictions regardless of conventional wisdom or potential consequences. Where Albus saw problems that required careful study, Gellert saw opportunities that demanded immediate exploitation. Where Albus felt burdened by responsibility to others, Gellert felt liberated by his superior understanding of what those others truly needed. Their philosophical discussions quickly evolved beyond abstract theorizing into concrete planning for how the magical world could be reorganized according to principles that recognized the natural hierarchy between those who possessed magical abilities and those who did not. Gellert spoke with passionate conviction about the artificial constraints that prevented wizards from taking their rightful place as leaders and protectors of human civilization, arguing that the statute of secrecy was not protection but cowardice, a voluntary exile that condemned both magical and non-magical peoples to lives that were far less fulfilling than they could be under proper guidance. The seductive power of these ideas was amplified by the personal context within which Albus encountered them. After years of watching his own exceptional abilities waste away in domestic drudgery, the prospect of using his talents for purposes that could benefit entire civilizations rather than single individuals was intoxicating beyond rational resistance. Gellert's vision offered not just escape from the cottage that had become his prison, but transformation of his sacrifice into something magnificent and historically significant. The phrase that would haunt Albus for the rest of his life emerged during one of their late-night conversations, when passion and intellectual excitement had dissolved the boundaries between personal desire and philosophical conviction. For the greater good, Gellert had declared, his voice ringing with absolute certainty as he outlined how temporary suffering could be justified when it served larger purposes, how individual rights could be subordinated to collective welfare when guided by superior wisdom and benevolent intention. The words seemed to crystallize everything that Albus had been thinking during his years of forced domesticity, providing intellectual framework for the utilitarian calculations that had allowed him to find meaning in unwanted sacrifice. But their growing intimacy was not merely intellectual, though both young men might have preferred to believe that their connection was purely philosophical rather than deeply personal. The attraction that sparked between them transcended the boundaries of friendship or academic collaboration, evolving into something that was simultaneously romantic and revolutionary, tender and ambitious, loving and ultimately destructive. Gellert's physical beauty was matched by mental brilliance that made him irresistible to someone who had been starved of both intellectual stimulation and emotional connection, while Albus's combination of genius and vulnerability appealed to Gellert's desire to find a partner worthy of the grand destiny he envisioned for himself. The summer days blended into a haze of passionate discussion and careful planning as they developed detailed strategies for implementing their vision of magical leadership over human civilization. They studied historical precedents, analyzed the current political structures that maintained the separation between magical and non-magical peoples, and design new forms of government that would allow wizards to guide human development while appearing to respect the autonomy of those they governed. Their notebooks filled with constitutional frameworks, organizational charts, and tactical analyses that would have horrified anyone who discovered them, but which seemed perfectly logical when viewed through the lens of their shared conviction that superior abilities created superior responsibilities. Albus found himself experiencing emotions that had been dormant during his years of domestic isolation, feelings that combined intellectual excitement with physical attraction in ways that made every conversation feel like a form of seduction and every shared glance carry the weight of revolutionary conspiracy. The cottage that had been his prison became a meeting place for planning that would reshape the world, while the brother and sister who had been his burdens became obstacles to a destiny that promised to fulfill every ambition he had been forced to abandon when duty called him home from his promising academic career. But Aberforth was not blind to the changes in his older brother, recognizing that Albus was becoming someone fundamentally different from the reluctant caregiver who had shouldered family responsibilities with stoic determination. The passionate discussions that continued long into the night, the secretive correspondence with contacts across magical Europe, the way Albus's eyes now burned with an enthusiasm that had nothing to do with Ariana's welfare. All of these developments troubled the younger brother, who understood that their family's stability depended on Albus's continued commitment to the sacrifices that circumstances had demanded. The tension between the brothers grew more pronounced as summer progressed, and Gellert's influence over Albus became increasingly obvious to anyone who cared to observe their interactions. Where Albus had once approached their sister's care with methodical dedication, he now seemed distracted, impatient, eager to delegate responsibilities that he had previously insisted on handling personally. The protective charms that required daily maintenance were neglected. The careful routines that kept Ariana stable were disrupted, and the atmosphere of the cottage grew heavy with unspoken conflicts that threatened to explode into open confrontation. Gellert's attitude toward the Dumbledore family situation was revealing in ways that should have warned Albus about the true nature of his beloved's character, but love has always been an unreliable judge of moral quality. When Gellert looked at Ariana, he saw not a damaged young woman deserving of protection and care, but an obstacle to plans that required Albus's complete attention and commitment. His suggestions for resolving the family situation ranged from the callously practical to the subtly cruel, always presented as logical solutions to problems that prevented more important work from being accomplished. The magical research they conducted together pushed boundaries that even Gellert's liberal education had not previously explored, delving into theoretical frameworks that treated human beings as resources to be managed rather than individuals deserving of respect and autonomy. Their experiments with memory modification, behavioral control, and mass persuasion techniques were justified as necessary preparation for the benevolent leadership they intended to provide. But the methods they developed could easily have been applied for less noble purposes by minds less convinced of their own righteousness. The Deathly Hallows became an obsession that consumed their attention during the final weeks of summer, when their research into legendary magical artifacts convinced them that ultimate power might be achievable through means that went far beyond conventional magical ability. Gellert's knowledge of the Hallows was comprehensive and disturbing, based on research that had contributed to his expulsion from Durmstrang and his subsequent travels through the darker corners of magical Europe. The three artifacts that could supposedly grant mastery over death itself seemed like the perfect tools for implementing their vision of magical leadership, providing power that no government or institution could resist or counter. The Elder Wand captured their imagination most completely, not just for its legendary invincibility in magical combat, but for its symbolic value as ultimate proof of wizarding superiority over all other forms of power. Gellert spoke of it with reverence that bordered on worship, describing how possession of such an artifact would make their authority unquestionable and their revolution irresistible. The wand's history of changing hands through violence troubled Albus initially, but Gellert argued persuasively that such concerns were irrelevant when the artifact would be used to prevent far greater violence through the establishment of just and benevolent magical government. Their plans grew more detailed and ambitious as summer drew toward its close, encompassing not just Britain, but all of magical Europe, and eventually extending to magical communities throughout the world. They envisioned themselves as philosopher kings whose superior understanding would guide human civilization toward unprecedented prosperity and fulfillment. With magical abilities openly displayed and properly utilized for the benefit of all sentient beings. The temporary disruption that such revolutionary change would necessarily cause was regrettable but insignificant when weighed against the centuries of improved existence that would follow their successful implementation of natural magical hierarchy. But their grand plans required Albus to abandon the family responsibilities that had defined his life for the past 2 years, leaving Ariana in Aberforth's sole care while he pursued a destiny that promised to transform him from frustrated domestic caregiver into world historical figure. The guilt that such abandonment would necessarily entail was rationalized through their philosophical framework. Individual sacrifice for the greater good was not just acceptable, but morally required when the welfare of entire pooled civilizations hung in the balance. Aberforth's opposition to these developments was immediate and absolute, recognizing that his brother was being seduced away from family loyalty by dreams that were both grandiose and dangerous. His confrontations with Albus grew more heated as the younger brother realized that reasoned argument was insufficient to counter the intoxicating combination of intellectual excitement and romantic passion that Gellert represented. The practical concerns about Ariana's care were dismissed as small-minded thinking that failed to grasp the larger purposes that justified temporary hardship for individual family members. The inevitable confrontation came on a late August evening when Aberforth's patience finally exhausted itself and he demanded that Albus choose definitively between family duty and revolutionary ambition. The argument that erupted was years of suppressed resentment and philosophical disagreement exploding into open warfare, with accusations and counter-accusations that revealed fundamental differences in how the brothers understood duty, love, and moral responsibility. Gellert's presence during this family crisis was inflammatory rather than calming. His obvious disdain for what he considered provincial concerns about domestic obligations, adding fuel to conflicts that might otherwise have been resolved through compromise and understanding. His suggestion that Ariana's condition could be permanently resolved through methods that he didn't care to specify in detail revealed the ruthless pragmatism that lay beneath his idealistic rhetoric about benevolent magical leadership. The three-way duel that followed was inevitable, given the emotional tensions and philosophical conflicts that had been building throughout the summer. Three powerful wizards whose anger and frustration found expression through magical violence that none of them was psychologically prepared to control. Albus and Aberforth's fraternal conflict was complicated by Gellert's participation, turning what might have been a family argument into a battle for the soul of wizarding ideology itself. The spells that flew between them were not the controlled demonstrations of magical dueling, but raw expressions of fury and fear, emotions too powerful to be contained within the civilized frameworks of formal combat. Albus found himself using techniques that Gellert had taught him, applications of magic that pushed beyond the boundaries of what he had previously considered acceptable, while Aberforth responded with the desperate determination of someone fighting to protect everything he held dear from forces he couldn't fully understand. Ariana's attempt to intervene in the duel was motivated by love and terror in equal measure, her fractured mind unable to comprehend the complex philosophical and personal issues that had driven her brothers to violence, but recognizing instinctively that their conflict threatened to destroy what remained of their family unity. Her magical abilities, always unpredictable and often destructive, erupted in response to the emotional chaos that surrounded her, adding another layer of dangerous energy to a situation that was already spiraling beyond anyone's ability to control. The moment of her death was simultaneously eternal and instantaneous, a convergence of magical forces that killed her so quickly that none of the three combatants could determine whose spell had struck the fatal blow. The silence that followed was more devastating than any curse, a complete absence of sound that seemed to drain meaning from everything that had preceded it. The brilliant plans for magical revolution, the passionate arguments about duty and destiny, the romantic dreams of shared power and purpose, all of it evaporated in the face of irreversible tragedy that made previous concerns seem trivial and meaningless. Gelert's immediate flight from the scene revealed aspects of his character that love had prevented Albus from recognizing during their intoxicating summer of shared ambitions. When confronted with the consequences of the ideas he had so passionately advocated, when forced to face the reality of what their philosophical frameworks meant when applied to actual human suffering, he chose escape over responsibility, abandonment over accountability. The revolution that had seemed so necessary and noble was suddenly less important than avoiding the legal and emotional consequences of a young woman's death. Albus was left alone with his brother's grief and his own crushing guilt. The brilliant future he had envisioned transformed into a nightmare of regret that would haunt every remaining day of his life. The philosophical framework that had justified abandoning family duty for greater purposes collapsed under the weight of actual loss, revealing itself as sophisticated rationalization for selfishness, rather than genuine moral insight. The utilitarian mathematics that had made individual sacrifice seem noble and necessary became a mockery when applied to his sister's unnecessary death. The investigation that followed was mercifully brief. Magical law enforcement's inquiry concluding that Ariana's death was accidental, the unfortunate result of magical combat between her brothers that she had tried unsuccessfully to interrupt. But legal exoneration could not address the psychological devastation that consumed Albus as he realized the full scope of what his romantic and intellectual infatuation had cost. The sister he had protected for years was dead. The brother he had argued with was inconsolable. And the lover who had inspired his betrayal of family loyalty was gone, without explanation or farewell. The transformation that began in those dark weeks after Ariana's funeral would continue for the rest of Albus's life, reshaping him from an ambitious young wizard drunk on possibilities into someone whose understanding of power was forever shadowed by knowledge of its potential for destruction. The guilt he carried was not merely personal but philosophical, recognition that his superior intellect and magical abilities had led him to make choices that destroyed the very people he should have been protecting through the proper use of his gifts. The pattern that emerged from this tragedy would define every major decision of his later life. The tendency to shoulder impossible burdens alone rather than risk involving others in dangerous schemes. The assumption that his mistakes were his responsibility to correct regardless of personal cost. The willingness to sacrifice his own happiness and health in service of what he perceived as moral obligations that others couldn't be expected to understand or share. But perhaps most significantly, Ariana's death taught him that love and ambition were not merely incompatible but actively destructive when combined in the same heart. That caring deeply about people made it impossible to treat them as variables in larger equations designed to serve abstract principles of greater good. The romantic passion that had made Gelert's revolutionary vision seem so appealing had blinded him to the human costs of political transformation, while his intellectual pride had prevented him from recognizing that superior abilities created superior responsibilities to protect rather than reshape the world around him. The letters that arrived sporadically over the following months, bearing Gelert's attempts to justify his departure and renew their collaboration, despite the tragedy that had interrupted their plans, went unanswered and eventually unread. The love that had burned so brightly during their summer of shared dreams was extinguished by the simple reality that some actions could not be undone, some losses could not be justified, Some prices were too high to be paid regardless of what purposes they might serve. The young Albus Dumbledore, who had been seduced by visions of magical revolution, died in the same moment as his sister, replaced by someone whose understanding of power would forever be tempered by intimate knowledge of its capacity to destroy the very things it claimed to protect. The man who emerged from those ashes would spend the rest of his life trying to atone for the choices that had cost Ariana her life and Aberforth his faith in family unity, making decision after decision that prioritized protection over ambition, sacrifice over achievement, lonely vigilance over shared purpose. But the philosophical framework that had justified abandoning family duty for revolutionary idealism would evolve rather than disappear, transforming from justification for personal ambition into rationalization for personal sacrifice. The utilitarian mathematics that had once made Ariana's needs seem less important than magical civilization's welfare would eventually make Harry Potter's childhood seem less important than his survival, would make Severus Snape's happiness seem less important than his usefulness, would make countless individual tragedies seem acceptable when weighed against collective benefit. The greatest tragedy of that terrible summer was not just Ariana's death, but the way her death shaped the moral reasoning of someone whose decisions would affect thousands of other lives over the subsequent decades. The guilt that consumed Albus was genuine and profound, but it also became a lens through which he viewed all subsequent moral choices, a standard of necessary sacrifice that he applied not just to himself but to everyone whose lives intersected with his understanding of what the greater good required. And so the seeds of future tragedies were planted in the soil of past regret, growing slowly but inevitably toward the harvest of consequences that would define the most complex and controversial figure in wizarding history. The boy who had learned too early to sacrifice dreams for duty became the man who would sacrifice others' dreams for what he perceived as duty. The lover who had been taught that personal happiness was incompatible with moral responsibility became the manipulator who would orchestrate others' happiness and misery according to strategic necessity. The summer of 1899 ended with a funeral and a flight, with love transformed into loss and ambition curdled into guilt. But its influence would echo through every year that followed, shaping choices and justifying sacrifices that would have been unthinkable to the idealistic young scholar who had once believed that superior abilities automatically conferred superior understanding of how those abilities should be used for the benefit of all. The autumn of 1938 brought with it the kind of persistent rain that seemed to leach hope from even the most optimistic souls, transforming London's streets into rivers of grey despair that reflected the growing darkness gathering across Europe like storm clouds pregnant with thunder. It was during this season of gathering shadows that Albus Dumbledore, now a respected professor at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, received a letter that would present him with an opportunity to prevent one of history's greatest tragedies, or, as events would prove, to fail so completely that his inaction would unleash horrors beyond imagination upon both magical and non-magical worlds. The correspondence came from Mrs. Cole, matron of Wool's Orphanage in London, a woman whose years of caring for society's unwanted children had given her the particular combination of compassion and pragmatism that marked those who worked daily with human suffering. Her letter was brief but compelling, describing a boy whose unusual incidents and disturbing behavior had convinced her that he might be one of those special children who belonged in the mysterious school that occasionally claimed her most extraordinary charges. Tom Marvolo Riddle was 11 years old when Albus first encountered him, sitting in the stark institutional parlour of Wool's Orphanage, with the unnatural stillness that marked children who had learned too early that the world was a dangerous place requiring constant vigilance. His physical beauty was startling even in that grim environment. Dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, pale skin that appeared almost luminous in the orphanage's dim interior, and features that would have belonged on a Renaissance sculpture, if not for the eyes that held depths of calculation that no child should possess. But it was not Tom's appearance that should have warned Albus of the dangers that lay ahead, but rather the careful way the boy conducted himself during their first interview, answering questions with precision that suggested he had been preparing for this conversation long before it began. Every response was calculated to provide exactly the information necessary while revealing nothing of his true thoughts or feelings. A level of self-control that spoke of either remarkable maturity or disturbing emotional detachment. The incidents that Mrs. Cole described in whispered tones after Tom had left the room painted a picture of a child whose magical abilities were not merely precocious but actively malevolent in their applications. A rabbit that had been found hanging in the orphanage wardrobe, killed with surgical precision that suggested intimate knowledge of anatomy rather than childish cruelty. 2 other children who had been discovered in a cave after disappearing for hours, their memories of the experience so thoroughly suppressed that they could only speak of shadows and cold laughter that followed them in their dreams. These were not the typical signs of accidental magic that marked most magical children before they learned proper control, but evidence of deliberate experimentation conducted by someone who understood instinctively that power over others could be exercised through fear as easily as through force. The other children's reaction to Tom's presence was telling. They maintained careful distance from him, not out of dislike, but out of the primitive recognition that predators inspire in potential prey. An understanding that transcended rational thought to touch something deeper and more fundamental about the nature of threat and safety. Albus recognized immediately that Tom possessed magical ability of extraordinary scope and sophistication, far beyond anything he had previously encountered in someone so young. But more troubling than the boy's raw power was the way he wielded it, with conscious intent rather than emotional outburst, with clear understanding of cause and effect, rather than accidental manifestation, with calculation that suggested he viewed other people as subjects for experimentation, rather than fellow human beings deserving of consideration and respect. The conversation that followed Tom's demonstration of his abilities should have been the beginning of intensive intervention designed to address the psychological damage that had obviously shaped his development. Instead, it became the first in a series of missed opportunities that would eventually cost thousands of lives and reshape the magical world in ways that would echo through generations. Albus saw the darkness that surrounded Tom like a visible aura, recognized the signs of a mind that had learned to find pleasure in others' pain, understood that this child represented potential for either extraordinary good or unimaginable evil, depending on the guidance he received during his crucial formative years. But the guilt that still consumed Albus over Ariana's death made him reluctant to involve himself deeply in another young person's psychological development, particularly one whose problems seemed so much more complex and dangerous than anything he had previously attempted to address. The lesson he had learned from his sister's tragedy was that love and care could not always overcome damage that went too deep, that good intentions could produce devastating consequences when applied to situations that required expertise he didn't possess. His decision to treat Tom as just another Hogwarts student, rather than a special case requiring extraordinary intervention, would prove to be one of the most catastrophic mistakes in wizarding history. But at the time it seemed like prudent caution, based on hard-won understanding of his own limitations. The boy clearly needed help that went far beyond anything a school could provide, but Albus convinced himself that exposure to proper magical education and healthy peer relationships might naturally correct the antisocial tendencies that institutional life had fostered. The small allowance he provided for Tom's school supplies and the basic information about Diagon Alley were presented as kindness, but they also represented a fundamental abdication of responsibility that would have far-reaching consequences. Sending an 11-year-old boy with a history of manipulative behavior and sadistic tendencies into the magical world without proper guidance or supervision was an act of negligence that no amount of good intentions could excuse. Tom's first venture into Diagon Alley was conducted alone, a damaged child, exploring a world of wonders and dangers with no adult oversight to help him understand the moral implications of the power that suddenly lay within his reach. The shopkeepers who served him saw only a polite, well-spoken boy whose obvious enthusiasm for magical learning was refreshing compared to the spoiled, pure-blood children who typically demanded their attention. They had no way of recognizing that they were providing tools and knowledge to someone who would eventually use both to terrorize the very community that welcomed him with such warmth. The books he purchased went far beyond the standard first-year curriculum, extending into areas of magic that most students wouldn't encounter until their final years at Hogwarts, if ever. His questions about dark arts, texts, and historical accounts of powerful wizards were answered with the helpful enthusiasm that magical merchants showed to any customer displaying genuine intellectual curiosity. No one thought to wonder why a child would be so specifically interested in methods of extending life, techniques for controlling other minds, or the theoretical foundations of magic that treated human beings as resources rather than individuals deserving of moral consideration. Albus's failure to provide proper supervision during this crucial introduction to magical society was compounded by his decision to allow Tom to navigate Hogwarts' social dynamics without the careful monitoring that his psychological profile clearly warranted. The Sorting Hat's placement of Tom in Slytherin House was predictable given his ambition and cunning, but it also surrounded him with students whose pure-blood supremacist beliefs provided fertile ground for the ideas that would eventually blossom into his campaign of magical terrorism. The teachers who encountered Tom during his first years at Hogwarts were universally impressed by his intellectual abilities and apparent dedication to learning, failing to recognize that his academic excellence was motivated not by genuine curiosity, but by hunger for power that could be gained through knowledge. His perfect grades and respectful demeanor masked a systematic study of human weakness that allowed him to manipulate both students and faculty with devastating effectiveness. Professor Slughorn's particular fondness for Tom was especially tragic, as the potions master's genuine affection for a brilliant student was exploited to gain access to information about magic that no student should have been allowed to pursue. The Horcrux question that Tom posed during one of Slughorn's parties was presented as theoretical inquiry from a curious mind, but it represented the first step toward atrocities that would make his childhood cruelties seem like innocent pranks by comparison. Albus observed Tom's growing influence over other students with concern that was never translated into meaningful action, watching as the boy assembled a circle of followers who were drawn by charisma that masked profound psychological damage. The group that would eventually become known as the Death Eaters began forming during Tom's school years. Young wizards and witches, whose own insecurities and prejudices made them vulnerable to manipulation by someone who understood instinctively how to exploit human weakness for personal gain. The incidents that occurred during Tom's time at Hogwarts should have prompted immediate intervention from school authorities, but each was carefully orchestrated to avoid direct attribution, while terrorizing anyone who might consider opposing his growing power. Students who challenged his authority found themselves victims of accidents that left them traumatized but unable to prove Tom's involvement. Teachers who questioned his activities discovered that their concerns were dismissed by colleagues who had been charmed into viewing Tom as a model student, whose exemplary behavior made accusations against him seem like jealous malice from less talented individuals. The opening of the Chamber of Secrets during Tom's 5th year represented the culmination of research that had been conducted openly in the Hogwarts library, using resources that should have been restricted but were made available to any student demonstrating sufficient academic interest. The monster that killed Myrtle Warren was unleashed by someone whose understanding of the school's hidden secrets exceeded that of most faculty members. Knowledge gained through systematic exploration that adults had mistaken for admirable curiosity about magical history. Albus's investigation into the chamber attacks was thorough but misdirected, focusing on external threats rather than considering that the perpetrator might be someone already within the school community. His failure to identify Tom as the heir of Slytherin responsible for the basilisk attacks was partly due to the boy's careful concealment of his involvement, but also reflected unwillingness to believe that someone so young and apparently promising could be capable of murder, conducted with such calculated precision. The framing of Hagrid for the attacks demonstrated Tom's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and institutional dynamics, recognizing that suspicion would naturally fall on the half-giant whose love of dangerous creatures was well known throughout the school. The way Tom manipulated evidence and witnesses to create a convincing case against an innocent person showed that his talents extended far beyond magical ability to encompass skills that would serve him well in his eventual career as a terrorist leader. But perhaps most tragically, Tom's success in avoiding consequences for his crimes taught him that authority figures could be deceived through careful presentation and strategic manipulation, that even the most perceptive adults would accept comfortable lies rather than confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil. The lesson he learned was not that his actions were wrong, but that they needed to be conducted more carefully to avoid detection by people whose moral blindness made them easy targets for deception. Albus's decision to allow Tom to graduate without addressing the clear evidence of his involvement in multiple crimes against fellow students was perhaps the single most consequential failure of judgment in magical history. The boy who left Hogwarts in 1945 was not the damaged but potentially redeemable child who had arrived 6 years earlier, but a fully formed psychopath whose education had provided him with both the magical knowledge and social skills necessary to implement plans that would terrorize 2 generations of magical Britain. The years immediately following Tom's graduation should have been a period of careful monitoring by magical law enforcement, given the pattern of incidents that had marked his school career. Instead, he was allowed to disappear into the broader wizarding world without oversight, free to pursue employment and associations that would further his understanding of both magical power and human weakness. The junior position he obtained at Borgin and Burke's was perfectly suited to someone whose interests lay in acquiring dangerous artifacts and developing relationships with witches and wizards, whose moral standards were flexible enough to accommodate activities that respectable society would condemn. Albus's occasional inquiries about Tom's post-Hogwarts activities were perfunctory rather than systematic, reflecting concern that was genuine but insufficient to motivate the kind of intensive investigation that the situation clearly warranted. The reports he received about Tom's employment and social connections painted a picture of a young man whose interests were somewhat unsavory but not obviously criminal, failing to capture the true scope of the research and relationship building that was laying the groundwork for future atrocities. The transformation of Tom Riddle into Lord Voldemort was not a sudden metamorphosis, but a gradual process that unfolded over years of careful preparation, each step building upon lessons learned during his time at Hogwarts about how power could be acquired and exercised without triggering effective opposition from authorities. The murders that created his first Horcruxes were conducted with the same calculated precision that had marked his childhood experiments, but now enhanced by magical knowledge and social connections that made detection and prosecution virtually impossible. The Horcruxes themselves represented the ultimate expression of the philosophy that Tom had been developing since childhood, that other people existed primarily as tools or obstacles to his personal ambitions, that their lives had value only insofar as they served his purposes, that love and human connection were weaknesses to be exploited rather than strengths to be cultivated. The magic required to split his soul was not just technically complex, but morally abhorrent, requiring a level of callousness that most wizards would find impossible to achieve, even if they possessed the necessary knowledge. Albus's failure to prevent Tom's creation of Horcruxes was partly due to ignorance about the specific magical techniques involved, but also reflected his unwillingness to believe that someone he had known as a student could pursue such ultimate expressions of evil. The comfortable assumption that even damaged people retained some essential humanity that could be appealed to through reason or compassion was shattered by someone whose psychological development had progressed far beyond the point where normal moral considerations had any relevance to his decision-making process. The recruitment of followers that began during Tom's early adulthood drew heavily upon relationships established during his Hogwarts years, former classmates, whose loyalty had been cultivated through careful attention to their individual weaknesses and desires. The Death Eaters, who would eventually terrorize magical Britain, were not recruited through ideology alone, but through psychological manipulation that exploited their need for belonging, recognition, and power in ways that made loyalty to Voldemort seem like the path to personal fulfillment rather than moral degradation. The escalation from individual murders to mass terrorism followed logically from the foundation that had been laid during Tom's school years, when he had learned that fear was more effective than persuasion for controlling human behavior. That dramatic displays of power created psychological impacts that extended far beyond their immediate victims. The attacks that would eventually bring magical Britain to the brink of collapse were not spontaneous expressions of rage, but carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to achieve specific strategic objectives through the systematic application of terror. Albus's growing awareness of his failure to prevent Voldemort's rise was matched by understanding that the opportunity for early intervention had been irretrievably lost, that the boy who might have been saved through proper care and guidance had been transformed into a monster whose capacity for evil exceeded anything in recorded magical history. The guilt that consumed him was not merely personal but professional, recognition that someone whose expertise in understanding human nature should have enabled him to recognize and address Tom's psychological problems had instead enabled those problems to metastasize into threats that endangered entire civilizations. The pattern that emerged from this catastrophic failure would define Albus's approach to similar situations throughout the rest of his career, creating a tendency to over-involve himself in the lives of other troubled young people as compensation for his neglect of Tom Riddle. The intensive attention he would later pay to Harry Potter's development was motivated partly by genuine care, but also by determination to avoid repeating the mistakes that had allowed one damaged child to become the most dangerous wizard in history. But the lessons Albus learned from the Tom Riddle disaster were incomplete and potentially counterproductive, focusing on the need for greater intervention without addressing the fundamental philosophical issues that had contributed to his original failure. The utilitarian framework that had justified neglecting Tom's psychological needs in favor of broader institutional responsibilities evolved into a different form of utilitarian calculation that would justify manipulating Harry's psychological development in service of strategic objectives that required his willing self-sacrifice. The transformation of guilt into renewed dedication to protecting others was admirable in its intentions but problematic in its implementation. as Albus's determination to atone for past failures created new forms of moral blindness that would produce their own tragic consequences. The boy he had failed to save became the enemy he would spend the rest of his life fighting, while the boy he would try to save through intensive manipulation would become the weapon he needed to destroy the monster his earlier negligence had created. The circular tragedy of these relationships: failure creating enemy, enemy requiring weapon, weapon requiring manipulation that echoed original failure, would define the most complex moral legacy in magical history, raising questions about the relationship between individual responsibility and collective welfare that had no easy answers. The child who had been abandoned to his own psychological demons became the demon that haunted every subsequent choice about how much individual suffering could be justified in service of preventing greater collective tragedy. And so Tom Riddle's transformation into Lord Voldemort stood as permanent testament to the devastating consequences of moral cowardice disguised as prudent restraint, of choosing comfortable inaction over difficult intervention, of allowing philosophical abstractions about the greater good to obscure immediate human needs that required attention, regardless of their inconvenience to larger plans and purposes. The failure that created the wizarding world's greatest enemy would cast shadows across every remaining year of Albus Dumbledore's life, shaping decisions that would save thousands of lives, while costing others their innocence, their happiness, and ultimately their faith in the very concept of heroism that his legend was supposed to represent. The autumn of 1991 should have been a time of healing and renewal for the wizarding world, a season when children could return to school without fear that ancient evils would reach out from the shadows to claim their innocence. 10 years had passed since Voldemort's apparent defeat at the hands of infant Harry Potter, a decade during which the magical community had slowly rebuilt the trust and normalcy that terror had destroyed. But Albus Dumbledore, whose understanding of darkness ran deeper than most could comprehend, recognized that evil rarely dies as completely as comfortable people prefer to believe. The decision to house the Philosopher's Stone at Hogwarts rather than destroy it outright would prove to be one of his most controversial choices, a calculated gamble that placed hundreds of young lives at risk in service of objectives that he shared with no one else. Nicholas Flamel's legendary creation represented more than mere alchemical achievement. It was the key to immortality itself, the ultimate prize that dark wizards throughout history had sought through methods ranging from brilliant scholarship to unspeakable atrocity. Its very existence was a temptation that would draw every ambitious soul who had ever feared death's embrace. The official reasoning behind the stone's relocation was sound enough to satisfy ministry officials who preferred simple explanations to complex truths. Gringotts Bank, despite its formidable reputation for security, had suffered a break-in that suggested vulnerabilities in even the most sophisticated protective measures. The goblins' assurances that their vaults remained impregnable rang hollow when weighed against evidence that someone had possessed both the skill and audacity to penetrate defenses that had stood unchallenged for centuries. If the stone was truly at risk, then surely the ancient protections of Hogwarts School offered better sanctuary than any commercial institution could provide. But Albus's true motivations were far more complex and morally ambiguous than any public justification could encompass. The stone's presence at Hogwarts was not merely protective relocation, but deliberate bait, designed to draw out enemies whose identities remained hidden but whose intentions were becoming increasingly clear. Someone with intimate knowledge of the magical world's most precious secrets was orchestrating events from the shadows, and the only way to expose such sophisticated opposition was to offer them a prize too tempting to resist, while maintaining enough control over circumstances to prevent their success. The protections he designed for the stone were elaborate beyond any reasonable security requirement, a gauntlet of magical challenges that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Each obstacle was crafted not merely to deter intruders but to test specific qualities of character and magical ability, creating a sorting mechanism that would separate casual thieves from genuinely dangerous adversaries, while providing valuable intelligence about the capabilities and motivations of anyone bold enough to attempt the theft. Professor Sprout's Devil's Snare was positioned as the first serious challenge, a plant whose aggression toward intruders was balanced by vulnerability that knowledgeable opponents could exploit through calm reasoning rather than panicked violence. The message was clear. This was a test of both botanical knowledge and psychological composure, eliminating anyone whose education or temperament was insufficient for the trials ahead while allowing properly prepared individuals to demonstrate their worthiness to continue. Professor Flitwick's flying keys created an environment where magical skill alone was insufficient without physical coordination and tactical thinking, requiring intruders to display the kind of comprehensive ability that marked truly dangerous opponents. The enchantment was beautiful in its complexity, hundreds of winged keys darting through the air in patterns that seemed random, but actually followed sophisticated mathematical principles that could be decoded by anyone with sufficient intelligence and patience. Professor McGonagall's giant chess set elevated the challenge from physical and magical to purely intellectual, demanding strategic thinking of the highest order, while requiring players to accept that victory might cost the sacrifice of pieces they had come to value. The symbolism was deliberate and disturbing. Success required willingness to treat allies as expendable resources, a psychological test that would eliminate anyone whose moral qualms prevented them from making calculated sacrifices for strategic advantage. Professor Quirrell's Mountain Troll presented perhaps the most straightforward challenge, a test of raw magical combat ability that would determine whether intruders possessed the power necessary to face the final guardian. But even this apparently simple obstacle served deeper purposes, as the specific spells required to overcome a fully grown troll would provide valuable intelligence about the magical traditions and training of anyone who succeeded in the attempt. Professor Snape's potion puzzle was perhaps the most elegant trap in the entire sequence, a logical problem that could only be solved through careful analysis and deductive reasoning while resisting the psychological pressure created by advancing flames and dwindling time. The challenge eliminated anyone who relied primarily on magical power rather than intellectual ability, ensuring that only the most sophisticated opponents would reach the final chamber where the stone awaited its would-be thieves. But the Mirror of Erised, which served as the ultimate protection for the stone itself, represented Albus's most profound insight into human psychology and magical theory. The ancient artifact had been modified to respond not to desire for possession but to desire for the stone's existence without personal gain, a paradox that could only be resolved by someone whose motivations were genuinely altruistic rather than self-serving. The enchantment was brilliant in its simplicity. Only someone who wanted to find the stone but not use it could actually acquire it, making theft impossible for anyone whose intentions were selfish. Yet, this elaborate security system was designed with a fatal flaw that Albus had built deliberately into its structure. The protections could be overcome by a group of determined first-year students working together, using knowledge and skills that any reasonably competent Hogwarts education should provide. The implication was terrifying in its clarity. If 11-year-old children could penetrate these defenses, then the system was not truly intended to prevent access, but to control and observe it. Harry Potter's involvement in the stone's protection was not accidental discovery, but carefully orchestrated manipulation, beginning with his placement in circumstances that would naturally lead to curiosity about the forbidden corridor on the third floor. The information he overheard about the stone's location and nature was provided through channels that Albus controlled, ensuring that the boy's investigation would follow predictable patterns while appearing to result from his own initiative and heroic instincts. Hagrid's role in these events was perhaps the most cruel aspect of Albus's manipulation, exploiting the half-giant's genuine affection for Harry and natural tendency toward indiscretion to provide crucial information at precisely the moments when it would have maximum impact on the boy's decision-making process. The revelation about Fluffy's weakness, the hints about the stone's significance, the casual mentions of protective measures, all were delivered with the innocent helpfulness that marked Hagrid's interactions with students he cared about, making him an unwitting accomplice in plans that he would have opposed if he had understood their true scope. The dragon egg that found its way into Hagrid's possession during the crucial period was not coincidental acquisition, but deliberately planted temptation, designed to create the circumstances that would lead to his temporary removal from the school grounds at exactly the moment when his absence would allow events to proceed according to Albus's careful timeline. The illegal creature provided perfect pretext for requiring Hagrid's attention elsewhere, while his predictable resistance to authority ensured that the situation would escalate in ways that served the larger strategic purpose. Professor Quirrell's possession by Voldemort was known to Albus from the beginning of the school year, his enhanced magical senses easily detecting the Dark Lord's presence, despite the sophisticated concealment magic that fooled less perceptive observers. The decision to allow the possessed teacher to remain at Hogwarts, interacting daily with students whose lives were at risk from proximity to such concentrated evil, represented a calculated gamble that prioritized strategic objectives over immediate safety concerns. The psychological preparation of Harry for his inevitable confrontation with Voldemort began during his very first weeks at Hogwarts. Subtle manipulations designed to build confidence and moral resolve, while providing the specific knowledge and relationships that would be necessary for survival when the final test arrived. His friendship with Ron and Hermione was encouraged through careful arrangement of circumstances that brought them together, creating the support network that would enable him to overcome challenges that would have defeated any individual student. The information about his parents' sacrifice and the protection it provided was revealed through carefully controlled circumstances that would maximize its psychological impact, while ensuring that Harry understood both the power, limitations of the magic that had saved his life as an infant. The knowledge was crucial for his survival, but also represented a form of emotional manipulation, using his love for parents he had never known to motivate choices that served strategic purposes rather than personal welfare. The absence of adult supervision during the crucial confrontation was not oversight but deliberate strategy, ensuring that Harry would face Voldemort alone, and thereby demonstrate both to himself and to observers the reality of his unique connection to the Dark Lord. The encounter would provide invaluable intelligence about Voldemort's current capabilities and future intentions, while establishing Harry's credentials as someone who could survive direct confrontation with forces that had destroyed more experienced wizards. But perhaps most disturbing was Albus's calculation that Harry's death during this encounter was an acceptable risk given the information and strategic advantages that his sacrifice might provide. The boy's survival was hoped for, but not essential to the larger plan, which could have proceeded with martyrdom serving to inspire resistance while revealing crucial details about Voldemort's methods and limitations that would benefit future efforts to destroy him permanently. The Mirror of Erisseed's protection ensured that Harry could not be corrupted by the stone's power even if he succeeded in obtaining it. But the deeper purpose of this safeguard was to preserve his moral purity for future tests that would require absolutely clean hands and untainted motivations. His character was being shaped as carefully as any weapon, with each experience designed to strengthen specific qualities that would be necessary for the ultimate confrontation that lay years in the future. The physical injuries that Harry sustained during his adventure beneath the school were relatively minor, but the psychological impact was profound and entirely intentional. His direct experience of Voldemort's presence, his understanding of the reality behind the legends, his acceptance of personal responsibility for outcomes that affected entire communities. All of these developments were crucial for his eventual role as the Wizarding World's champion against returning darkness. Ron's sacrifice during the chess game served multiple purposes beyond the immediate tactical necessity of advancing through McGonagall's challenge. The experience taught Harry that victory might require accepting the loss of people he cared about, while demonstrating that his friends were willing to make ultimate sacrifices for causes they believed served purposes greater than their individual welfare. The lesson would prove essential when later circumstances demanded even more terrible choices about who lived and who died in service of strategic objectives. Hermione's contribution to their success was equally important for Harry's development, showing him that intellectual preparation and logical analysis were as crucial as courage and determination when facing seemingly impossible challenges. Her presence ensured that their adventure succeeded through knowledge and teamwork rather than luck and individual heroics, establishing patterns of collaboration that would be vital for future confrontations with more sophisticated enemies. The revelation of Professor Quirrell as the possessed teacher rather than Severus Snape served to teach Harry crucial lessons about the deceptive nature of appearances and the danger of assuming that obvious suspects were necessarily guilty parties. The experience was designed to make him more cautious about judgments based on surface impressions, while demonstrating that true enemies often hid behind masks of respectability and apparent weakness. But the most significant aspect of the entire adventure was not the specific challenges overcome or lessons learned, but the precedent established for using Hogwarts as a battlefield where student lives were risked for strategic purposes that transcended normal educational objectives. The message was clear. The school was not merely an institution of learning, but a fortress in an ongoing war, where young people would be expected to participate in conflicts that previous generations had considered appropriate only for trained adult combatants. The parents who entrusted their children to Hogwarts care had no understanding that their sons and daughters were being prepared not just for careers in magical professions, but for roles in conflicts that would demand everything they had to give. The education they received would include practical experience with life and death situations, moral challenges that would test their fundamental values, and psychological pressures that would either forge them into heroes or break them entirely under weights that no childhood should be asked to bear. The other students who witnessed Harry's triumph over the forces that had threatened their school learned their own lessons about the nature of heroism and sacrifice, understanding that extraordinary circumstances might require extraordinary responses from anyone who possessed the courage and ability to act when others could not. The experience changed the entire culture of Hogwarts, from sanctuary of learning to training ground for warriors, though most observers would not recognize this transformation until much later, when its consequences became impossible to ignore. The success of the stone's defense validated Albus's approach to using calculated risks and controlled dangers as tools for character development and intelligence gathering, establishing patterns that would guide his decisions throughout the increasingly perilous years that followed. Each subsequent crisis would be approached with similar methodology: apparent protection, masking deeper purposes, student safety subordinated to strategic objectives, individual trauma accepted as necessary cost for collective benefit. The destruction of the Philosopher's Stone after its successful defense was presented as prudent caution, eliminating temptation that might attract future attacks, while ensuring that the power of immortality would not fall into unworthy hands. But the deeper truth was that the stone had served its purpose as bait and test, providing the intelligence and character development that had been its true objectives from the beginning. Its destruction was not loss but completion, the final step in a plan that had achieved everything its architect had intended. The precedent established during Harry's first year at Hogwarts would echo through every subsequent crisis that challenged the wizarding world's peace and stability, creating expectations about student participation in dangerous events that would ultimately cost young lives while serving purposes that only their manipulator fully understood. The boy who had survived his encounter with Voldemort was changed forever by the experience, shaped into someone whose understanding of duty and sacrifice would make him capable of choices that his younger self could never have imagined making. And so the Philosopher's Stone's brief residence at Hogwarts accomplished objectives that went far beyond simple protection of a valuable artifact, establishing patterns of risk and manipulation that would define the most controversial aspects of Albus Dumbledore's leadership during the dark years that lay ahead. The children who had been tested by fire emerged as something different from ordinary students, marked by experiences that prepared them for roles they had never chosen but would be expected to fulfill when circumstances demanded everything their education had taught them about courage, sacrifice, and the terrible mathematics of war. The spring of 1993 arrived at Hogwarts with an atmosphere thick as morning fog, heavy with the kind of unspoken dread that settles over communities when ancient terrors stir from their slumber to walk among the living once again. The Chamber of Secrets had been opened, and with it came whispers of a legend so dark that even professors who had taught at the school for decades found themselves glancing nervously at shadows that had never seemed threatening before. Students moved through corridors that had once felt like sanctuaries with the careful steps of those who understood that safety was an illusion that could be shattered by forces they could neither see nor comprehend. Albus Dumbledore stood at the window of his circular office, watching the grounds below where children who should have been playing Quidditch instead huddled in nervous groups, their conversations dominated by speculation about which among them might be targeted next by whatever monster had taken residence in the bowels of their ancient school. His phoenix forks sang softly from his perch, the magical bird's song providing comfort that felt desperately inadequate given the magnitude of the crisis that was unfolding with each passing day. The petrifications had begun with Mrs. Norris, Argus Filch's beloved cat, found rigid as stone beneath a message written in what appeared to be blood. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware. The symbolism was both theatrical and terrifying, suggesting that whoever had awakened the chamber's guardian possessed not just magical power sufficient to control legendary monsters, but psychological sophistication that understood how fear could be weaponized against entire communities through carefully orchestrated displays of supernatural menace. Colin Creevey was the first student to fall victim to the basilisk's petrifying gaze, discovered clutching his camera with the desperate hope that somehow capturing images of his attacker might provide protection, or at least evidence of what had claimed his mobility and left him trapped in a body that had become his own prison. The photograph that remained in his camera showed nothing but swirling shadows, but the terror frozen in his marble features spoke eloquently of the horror he had witnessed in the moments before consciousness fled. Justin Finch Fletchley and nearly headless Nick were found together, one petrified and the other somehow more ghostly than usual, as if even death could not provide complete immunity from whatever force was stalking the corridors of Hogwarts with predatory patience. The sight of a ghost affected by the basilisk's gaze confirmed that the threat transcended normal magical categories, suggesting they faced something primordial that operated according to rules that conventional magical education had never prepared them to understand. Hermione Granger's petrification was perhaps the most devastating blow to morale, as her encyclopedic knowledge of magical theory and protective spells had made her seem invulnerable to dangers that could be overcome through preparation and intelligence. Her rigid form clutched a mirror and a piece of paper torn from a library book, clues that she had somehow discovered the identity of their attacker in the moments before falling victim to the very monster she had been researching. But Albus's reaction to these tragedies was not the immediate action that the situation seemed to demand, but rather a careful campaign of observation and strategic inaction that allowed the crisis to escalate while he gathered intelligence about forces whose true nature and objectives remained frustratingly opaque. His enhanced magical senses had detected the presence of dark magic within the school from the very beginning of the year, emanating from a source that seemed to move through the student population, like infection, spreading through a vulnerable community. The diary of Tom Marvolo Riddle had entered Hogwarts through Ginny Weasley, an 11-year-old girl whose excitement about finally attending the legendary school made her vulnerable to manipulation by forces she had no framework for understanding. The ancient artifact appeared to be nothing more than a blank journal, but its pages hungered for the thoughts and feelings of whoever wrote within them, feeding on emotional energy, while gradually imposing the personality and memories of its creator upon the unsuspecting victim. Albus recognized immediately that the diary represented a form of dark magic that transcended anything in his extensive experience with malevolent artifacts, but his investigation proceeded with academic caution rather than the urgency that the situation clearly demanded. The methodical approach that served him well in theoretical research proved tragically inadequate when applied to a crisis where every day of delay increased the risk that students would die rather than merely suffer petrification. His suspicions about the diary's connection to Tom Riddle were confirmed through careful analysis of the magical signatures that emanated from affected areas of the school, resonances that matched records he had kept from his former students' time at Hogwarts decades earlier. But this knowledge was not shared with other faculty members or ministry officials, held instead as private intelligence that might prove strategically valuable when the true scope of Voldemort's return became clear. The decision to allow Ginny's possession to continue without intervention was perhaps the most morally questionable choice of Albus's entire career, a calculated gamble that treated an 11-year-old child as an acceptable sacrifice if her suffering could provide crucial information about enemy capabilities and intentions. Each day that passed saw her growing paler and more withdrawn, as the diary drained her life force to strengthen its hold on physical reality. But still he waited for developments that might justify the risks he was accepting on her behalf. The political pressure that led to his temporary removal from Hogwarts was not unwelcome interference, but convenient cover for activities that could not be conducted openly without revealing the true nature of threats that the magical community was not psychologically prepared to acknowledge. His apparent exile allowed him to investigate connections between current events and historical patterns, while maintaining the fiction that he was powerless to influence events unfolding at the school. Cornelius Fudge's decision to arrest Hagrid as a scapegoat for the chamber attacks served Albus's purposes by removing the half-giant whose emotional volatility might have disrupted carefully laid plans during their most crucial phase. The injustice of imprisoning an innocent man troubled him, but the tactical advantage of having potential complications contained in Azkaban outweighed moral qualms about allowing political cowardice to be served by judicial corruption. The Board of Governors' vote to suspend him from his position was orchestrated through Lucius Malfoy's influence, but Albus recognized the Malfoy family's involvement as confirmation that the diary's placement had been deliberate rather than accidental. The knowledge that respected pure-blood families were participating in plots to undermine Hogwarts provided valuable intelligence about the scope of support that Voldemort still commanded even after his apparent defeat. Harry Potter's investigation into the chamber mystery proceeded along predictable lines. His natural curiosity about threats to his adoptive home, combining with loyalty to friends who had been attacked to motivate exactly the kind of heroic intervention that the situation required. His discovery of the diary in Myrtle's bathroom was not coincidental encounter, but carefully orchestrated revelation, timed to occur when his emotional investment in solving the crisis would overcome any rational caution about handling unknown magical artifacts. The memories that Tom Riddle shared with Harry through the diary were selective presentations of historical truth, designed to establish credibility while concealing the full scope of the threat they faced. The young Tom's apparent helpfulness in identifying Hagrid as the chamber's previous opener served multiple purposes, providing believable explanation for current events while directing suspicion away from the true perpetrator, who was simultaneously the memory's source and its intended beneficiary. But perhaps most crucially, the diary's interaction with Harry provided Tom's memory with access to information about the boy who had somehow survived the killing curse, intelligence that would prove invaluable when future schemes required understanding of Harry's capabilities and psychological vulnerabilities. Each conversation was reconnaissance disguised as assistance, mapping the mental landscape of someone whose continued existence represented the greatest threat to Voldemort's eventual return. Ginny's deterioration accelerated as the school year progressed, and the diary's hold on her life force grew stronger, her physical weakness paralleled by increasing loss of memory and identity, as Tom's personality gradually overwrote her own. The symptoms were obvious to anyone trained in recognizing possession, but they were interpreted as natural response to stress, rather than supernatural predation by teachers who had never encountered such sophisticated forms of mental invasion. The attacks on students continued with escalating frequency as the basilisk, controlled through Ginny's unwilling commands, sought victims whose petrification would spread maximum terror while avoiding actual deaths that might prompt ministry intervention too decisive to be politically managed. The creature's thousand-year existence in the chamber's depths had refined its hunting instincts to precise calculations about how much destruction could be caused without triggering responses that might threaten its survival. Lockhart's appointment as defense against the dark arts professor had been influenced by Albus's recognition that the position needed to be filled by someone whose incompetence would not interfere with events that required careful orchestration rather than effective teaching. The fraud's presence ensured that students would not receive instruction that might enable them to recognize or resist the forces that were manipulating events from behind comfortable facades of normalcy. The dueling club that Lockhart organized with Snape's reluctant assistance provided Harry with his first public demonstration of Parseltongue abilities, revealing connections to Slytherin heritage that had been carefully concealed since his arrival at Hogwarts. The reaction from students and faculty confirmed that this revelation would complicate Harry's social relationships while providing crucial intelligence about inherited abilities that might prove significant in future confrontations. With Voldemort, the spiders fleeing into the Forbidden Forest were responding to instinctive recognition that their ancient enemy had awakened, their mass exodus providing clear evidence about the nature of the chamber's guardian for anyone knowledgeable enough to interpret the signs correctly. But this information was not shared with students whose panic about the attacks had already reached levels that threatened to close the school permanently. Aragog's revelation about the basilisk's identity came through Harry and Ron's unauthorized expedition into the forest, a dangerous adventure that provided crucial intelligence while testing their courage under circumstances that adult supervision could not have duplicated. The giant spider's testimony about events 50 years earlier confirmed connections between current attacks and historical precedents, while revealing the true scope of prejudice that had allowed innocent creatures to be blamed for human crimes. The message announcing that a student had been taken into the chamber marked the crisis's transition from terrorism through petrification to direct threat of murder, escalating pressure on school authorities, while providing Tom's memory with access to the chamber itself. Through Ginny's unwilling physical presence, her abduction was not random victim selection, but strategic choice of someone whose blood connection to the Weasley family made her particularly suitable for the ritual magic required to restore Tom's physical form. The staff meeting that concluded with Lockhart's assignment to rescue Ginny was theatre designed to maintain appearances of institutional response, while ensuring that the real rescue attempt would fall to Harry, whose unique abilities and personal investment made him the only person capable of surviving direct confrontation with a basilisk in its native environment. The fraud's protests about his qualifications were answered with assignments that everyone knew he could not fulfill, creating justification for student intervention when adult assistance proved inadequate. Harry's descent into the chamber with Ron and Lockhart represented the culmination of months of careful preparation, his knowledge of the crisis's history and nature providing him with advantages that would be necessary for survival in an environment designed to kill intruders. The memory charm that backfired on Lockhart was poetic justice, but also tactical convenience, removing an unreliable adult whose presence might have complicated the confrontation that had to occur between Harry and Tom's memory. The chamber itself was a testament to Salazar Slytherin's architectural genius and magical power, a vast underground cathedral designed to house creatures and artifacts that even other founders would have found disturbing. The ancient magic that permeated its walls was so concentrated that normal protective spells became unreliable, creating an environment where survival depended on qualities that could not be learned from textbooks or acquired through conventional magical education. Tom Riddle's physical manifestation grew stronger as Ginny's life force drained away, the diary's dark magic converting her vitality into the substance necessary to give memory corporeal form. His appearance was that of the handsome, charismatic student who had manipulated faculty and students alike during his own school years, but enhanced by knowledge and malevolence that 50 years of existence as disembodied consciousness had refined into instruments of supernatural menace. The conversation between Harry and Tom's memory revealed the true scope of the plot that had endangered the entire school, but also demonstrated the psychological weaknesses that would eventually prove fatal to Voldemort's ambitions. Tom's need to explain his cleverness, to be admired and feared for his superior intelligence and magical power, created opportunities for resistance that more circumspect enemies would never have allowed. The basilisk that emerged from Slytherin's statue was a creature of legendary size and malevolence, its 1,000-year existence in the chamber's depths having enhanced both its physical capabilities and its taste for human prey. The monster's obedience to Tom's commands was absolute, but its hunting instincts were shaped by centuries of isolation that made it particularly vulnerable to tactics that exploited its unfamiliarity with opponents who possessed knowledge of its weaknesses. Fawkes's intervention in the battle was not coincidental timing, but carefully orchestrated assistance. The Phoenix's presence, ensuring that Harry would have the tools necessary for victory, while maintaining the appearance of fortuitous circumstance rather than deliberate manipulation. The bird's tears, which healed the basilisk's venomous bite, and its delivery of the sorting hat, which provided Godric Gryffindor's sword, represented preparations that had been made long before the crisis began. The sword of Gryffindor, that materialized from the sorting hat was impregnated with basilisk venom from Harry's successful battle, transforming it into one of the few weapons capable of destroying Horcruxes through magical means that went beyond simple physical destruction. The enhancement was not accidental byproduct but intended consequence, creating tools that would be necessary for future battles against enemies whose defenses exceeded anything conventional magic could overcome. Harry's destruction of the diary through basilisk venom was simultaneously rescue of Ginny and elimination of Tom's memory, but it also represented his first successful destruction of a Horcrux, though he would not understand the significance of this achievement until years later, when the full scope of Voldemort's defenses against death was finally revealed. The experience provided crucial, practical education in techniques that would prove essential for the ultimate confrontation that lay in the distant but rapidly approaching future. Ginny's recovery was gradual and incomplete, her year of possession leaving psychological scars that would affect her relationships and magical development for the remainder of her time at Hogwarts. The trauma she had experienced was beyond anything that normal therapeutic approaches could address, requiring forms of healing that acknowledged the supernatural violation she had endured, while helping her reconstruct an identity that had been systematically dismantled by forces beyond her comprehension. Albus's return to Hogwarts was greeted with relief by students and faculty, who had never understood how deliberately his absence had been timed to allow events to unfold, according to plans that required his apparent powerlessness to preuve en disaster. His reinstatement was presented as victory of justice over political corruption, but the deeper truth was that his exile had accomplished objectives that could not have been achieved through direct intervention. The intelligence gained from allowing the crisis to develop naturally was invaluable for understanding both Voldemort's methods and the scope of support he still commanded within respectable wizarding society. The diary's presence at Hogwarts had revealed networks of collaboration that extended far beyond obvious Death Eater sympathizers, while the chamber's opening had provided practical education in fighting legendary monsters under conditions that no training program could duplicate. But perhaps most significantly, the crisis had tested Harry's character under circumstances that revealed qualities essential for his future role as champion against returning darkness. His willingness to risk his own life to save someone he barely knew, his ability to inspire loyalty from magical creatures, his resistance to psychological manipulation by enemies who understood his emotional vulnerabilities. All of these traits had been demonstrated under conditions that validated their authenticity. The cost of this education was measured in trauma inflicted on children who had never chosen to participate in conflicts that previous generations would have considered appropriate only for trained adult combatants. Ginny's year of possession, the petrified student's months of paralysis, the atmosphere of terror that had poisoned what should have been a sanctuary of learning. All of these prices had been accepted as necessary investments in preparation for greater battles that lay ahead. The precedent established during the chamber crisis, that student safety could be subordinated to strategic objectives, when circumstances demanded intelligence that could only be gained through allowing dangers to develop without premature intervention, would guide Albus's approach to subsequent crises that threatened not just individual lives but the survival of wizarding civilization itself. The children who had survived this test were forever changed by experiences that prepared them for roles they had never imagined accepting, warriors forged in fires that should never have been allowed to burn within the walls of any school. The autumn of 1994 arrived at Hogwarts with fanfare and celebration that masked undercurrents of danger flowing beneath the surface like poison in a crystal stream. The Tri-Wizard tournament had returned after a century of absence, bringing with it pageantry and international attention that transformed the ancient castle into a stage where young wizards would compete for glory while unseen forces orchestrated events toward purposes that none of the participants could imagine. The very air seemed to shimmer with anticipation and magic that felt both exhilarating and ominous, as if the castle itself understood that it was about to witness contests that would test more than magical skill and youthful courage. Albus Dumbledore stood before the assembled students and international delegations, his half-moon spectacles reflecting the candlelight as he spoke words of welcome that carried meanings which only he fully comprehended. The goblet of fire burned with ancient magic in the center of the great hall, its blue flames dancing hypnotically as they awaited the names of champions who would face trials designed to showcase the finest qualities of magical youth, while entertaining crowds who had no understanding of the true stakes involved in what they perceived as elaborate sport. The age line that surrounded the goblet was presented as crucial safety measure, preventing underage students from entering a competition whose dangers exceeded anything their education had prepared them to face. But those who understood the deeper currents of magic recognized that such protections were primarily theatrical, designed to maintain comfortable illusions about institutional responsibility, while creating obstacles that could be overcome by anyone with sufficient knowledge and determination to bypass conventional safeguards. The selection of champions proceeded with appropriate ceremony, each name emerging from the goblet's flames to thunderous applause from supporters who viewed the tournament as opportunity for their schools and nations to demonstrate superiority through proxy achievements of their finest young representatives. Victor Krum's selection surprised no one familiar with Durmstrang's reputation for producing wizards whose magical education emphasized practical application over theoretical study, while Fleur Delacour's emergence as Beauxbaton's champion reflected that institution's tradition of elegant magic that combined beauty with deadly effectiveness. Cedric Diggory's selection as Hogwarts champion was greeted with pride by students and faculty who recognized in the 17-year-old Hufflepuff the qualities of loyalty, fairness, and dedication that their school claimed to value above all others. His academic achievements were solid if not spectacular. His character was beyond reproach, and his magical abilities were sufficient for the challenges ahead without being so exceptional as to attract unwanted attention from forces that preferred to work through manipulation rather than direct confrontation. But the goblet's unexpected production of a fourth name shattered the ceremonial atmosphere like thunder in a cloudless sky, transforming celebration into confusion and accusation, as Harry Potter's selection violated every rule and precedent that governed the tournament's operation. The ancient magical contract that bound selected champions was absolute and unbreakable, but it was also specific about the conditions required for valid participation, making the boys' involuntary entry a mystery that demanded investigation by anyone who understood the magical principles involved. Albus's immediate response to this development was carefully calibrated performance of surprise and concern that concealed his recognition of the sophisticated manipulation required to confound an artifact whose magical protections had been refined over centuries of use. The Goblet of Fire was not merely ceremonial device, but instrument of ancient magic that responded to intent and worthiness rather than simple desire, making successful deception a feat that required intimate knowledge of its operation and access to magical techniques that few living wizards possessed. The investigation into Harry's selection was thorough but misdirected, focusing on obvious suspects whose motivations and capabilities made them convenient targets for suspicion, while overlooking possibilities that required more sophisticated analysis of the forces at work. Mad-Eye Moody's presence at Hogwarts as defense against the dark arts professor provided perfect cover for activities that genuine paranoia would have detected. but the retired Auror's legendary vigilance was assumed to make him ally rather than threat, in circumstances that demanded exactly the kind of constant suspicion that his reputation represented. The first task's selection of dragons as opponents was presented as test of courage and magical skill, but the creatures chosen represented dangers that exceeded anything reasonable competition should have encompassed. Hungarian horntails, Chinese fireballs, common Welsh greens, and Norwegian ridgebacks were not merely dangerous, but actively lethal, their presence transforming academic contest into potential massacre that could only be justified by objectives that transcended normal educational purposes. Harry's preparation for facing his dragon was inadequate by any reasonable standard. His research limited to library materials that provided theoretical knowledge without practical experience in confronting creatures whose natural aggression was enhanced by protective instincts surrounding their eggs. The golden egg that served as his objective was positioned to require maximum exposure to dragon attack, ensuring that success would depend more on luck and desperate courage than careful planning and superior preparation. The underwater task that followed was designed to test not just magical ability, but psychological resilience, forcing champions to venture into the lake's murky depths where visibility was limited, and conventional magic became unreliable due to interference from aquatic magical fields. The hostages taken for this challenge were people the champions cared about most, transforming academic exercise into emotional manipulation that used love as weapon against competitors who had never consented to having their relationships exploited for entertainment purposes. Hermione Granger's selection as Harry's hostage was particularly cruel, given her role as his closest friend and primary source of research assistance throughout their years at Hogwarts. Her unconscious form at the bottom of the lake represented not just personal stakes but intellectual resources that Harry depended upon for solving problems that exceeded his individual capabilities, making her rescue essential for reasons that went beyond simple friendship. Ron Weasley's presence among the hostages as well served to increase Harry's emotional investment while providing backup motivation in case primary attachments proved insufficient to drive him to maximum effort. The message was clear. Those he cared about would suffer consequences if he failed to meet expectations, establishing patterns of emotional manipulation that would characterize increasingly complex challenges as the tournament progressed toward its inevitable climax. Fleur Delacour's inability to complete the second task due to Grindylow interference demonstrated that even accomplished adult wizards could be overwhelmed by challenges that combined magical opposition with environmental hazards and time pressure. Her partial failure served to emphasize the real dangers involved while highlighting Harry's success in achieving objectives that had defeated competitors with superior training and experience. The maze that constituted the third task was perhaps the most sinister challenge of all. Its pathways, concealing dangers that ranged from magical creatures to psychological trials, designed to test not just courage, but moral character under extreme duress. The Triwizard Cup that served as the maze's central objective was enhanced with portkey magic that would transport whoever touched it to locations unknown, transforming Victory Symbol into trap that could deliver champions directly into enemy hands. Barty Crouch Jr.'s impersonation of Mad-Eye Moody was masterful deception that relied upon intimate knowledge of the real Aurore's personality and habits, enhanced by Polyjuice Potion that provided perfect physical disguise while concealing the psychological differences that careful observation might have detected. His performance was so convincing that even Albus's enhanced perceptions failed to identify the substitution, demonstrating the sophistication of enemies whose planning extended far beyond simple magical ability. The trunk that served as Moody's prison was expanded through spatial magic to create adequate confinement while providing the hair samples necessary for maintaining polyjuice transformation over extended periods. The real Aurore's captivity was both cruel punishment for his reputation as Voldemort's most effective enemy and practical necessity for maintaining deception that required intimate knowledge of his memories and mannerisms. Crouch's manipulation of the tournament proceeded through subtle interventions that appeared helpful while steering events toward predetermined outcomes. His assistance to Harry disguised as favoritism from a teacher who recognized exceptional potential in a student facing impossible challenges. The guidance he provided was technically legitimate, but strategically designed to ensure Harry's participation in the final task, regardless of his performance in earlier challenges. The lessons in resisting the Imperious Curse were presented as practical education in defending against dark arts. But they also served to strengthen Harry's natural resistance to mental control, while providing Crouch with opportunities to study the boy's psychological responses under controlled conditions. The knowledge gained would prove valuable for planning future manipulations that would rely upon understanding of his emotional triggers and moral commitments. The information about Neville Longbottom's parents was shared in apparent kindness, but actually represented psychological warfare designed to increase Harry's sense of personal stakes in conflicts with Death Eaters, whose cruelty extended far beyond simple murder. The knowledge that torture could be worse than death was crucial preparation for challenges ahead, but it was delivered through methods that exploited trust relationships rather than honest education about historical realities. The pensive memories that Albus shared with Harry during this period were carefully selected presentations of historical truth designed to provide context for current events while concealing aspects of past conflicts that might complicate his willingness to accept necessary sacrifices. The trials of Death Eaters, who had claimed Imperious Curse compulsion, revealed the complexity of determining guilt and innocence in circumstances where magical coercion could override free will. But they also demonstrated the inadequacy of legal processes for addressing crimes that transcended normal human understanding. Igor Karkaroff's presence as Durmstrang headmaster was particularly troubling given his history as Death Eater, whose cooperation with Ministry investigations had purchased freedom from Azkaban imprisonment. His nervous behavior and constant vigilance suggested awareness of dangers that normal tournament security could not address, while his obvious fear revealed knowledge about enemy capabilities that he dared not share with authorities who might not survive the information. The Dark Mark's appearance at the Quidditch World Cup had been preview of returning terror, but its significance was downplayed by Ministry officials who preferred comfortable denial to acknowledgement that forces thought defeated were reorganizing for renewed conflict. The house elf found with Harry's wand represented convenient scapegoat for incident that required explanations simpler than the truth about coordinated terrorism conducted by enemies whose identities remained officially unknown. Severus Snape's increasing agitation throughout the school year reflected his unique position as double agent whose loyalties were questioned by both sides in conflicts, whose complexity exceeded simple categories of good and evil. His knowledge of dark arts and Death Eater psychology made him invaluable for understanding threats that conventional magical education could not address, but it also made him suspect to colleagues who viewed his past associations as permanent stains on his character and judgment. The Yule Ball that accompanied the tournament provided opportunities for social interactions that revealed character traits and relationship dynamics that would prove significant in future conflicts. But it also served as cover for intelligence gathering by agents whose identities remained concealed behind masks of academic respectability and international cooperation. The festivities masked surveillance and recruitment activities that took advantage of lowered guards and increased social mixing between normally separated communities. Harry's partnership with Parvati Patil for the ball was socially awkward but strategically insignificant. his lack of romantic sophistication proving less important than his demonstrated loyalty to friends and willingness to honor commitments even when more attractive alternatives presented themselves. The experience provided education in social obligations that would prove relevant for future responsibilities that required diplomatic skills alongside magical abilities. Ron's jealousy over Hermione's attendance with Victor Krum revealed emotional immaturity that could be exploited by enemies who understood how personal relationships could be weaponized against individuals whose effectiveness depended upon stable support networks. The conflict between friends demonstrated that even the strongest bonds could be strained by circumstances that created competing loyalties and misunderstood motivations. The third task's maze was filled with dangers that tested every aspect of magical education, while providing cover for the final stage of manipulation that would deliver Harry directly to Voldemort without requiring direct assault on the Prosit. Hogwarts defense. Blast-ended Scroots, Acromantulas, Boggarts, and Sphinx challenges were legitimate obstacles, but they also served to weaken and disorient competitors while concealing the maze's true purpose as an elaborate trap. Cedric Diggory's presence during the final challenge complicated plans that had been designed for Harry's solo participation, but his partnership with the younger champion actually served enemy purposes by providing additional emotional stakes that would enhance the psychological impact of events in the graveyard. The decision to share victory by touching the cup together was a noble gesture that demonstrated exactly the kind of moral character that made Harry suitable for roles that required willing self-sacrifice. The portkey transportation to Little Hangleton Graveyard was instantaneous and disorienting, delivering both champions to location that had been prepared specifically for Voldemort's return to physical form, through rituals that required willing participants' blood and unwilling victims' death. The cemetery's ancient magic was concentrated around the Riddle family tomb, providing ideal environment for resurrection magic that demanded connection to ancestry and heritage. Cedric's immediate murder was both practical necessity and psychological warfare, eliminating witness to events that needed to remain secret while demonstrating to Harry the reality of dangers he had been protected from during his years at Hogwarts. The killing curse that claimed the older boy's life was cast without hesitation or remorse, establishing the stakes for confrontation that would test every lesson about courage and sacrifice that his education had attempted to provide. The ritual that restored Voldemort's physical form was an abomination that violated every principle of magical ethics while achieving objectives that conventional magic could never have accomplished. Bone of the father unknowingly given, flesh of the servant willingly sacrificed, blood of the enemy forcibly taken. Each component represented violation of natural order that created being whose existence challenged fundamental assumptions about life, death, and the boundaries between them. Harry's witnessing of Voldemort's return was intended to provide the Dark Lord with psychological advantage, while demonstrating his power to someone whose survival would carry news of his resurrection back to communities that had believed themselves safe from threats they thought permanently defeated. The boy's terror and helplessness were meant to be permanent reminders of powerlessness in face of overwhelming evil, but they also revealed resources of courage that enemy planning had not adequately considered. The summoning of Death Eaters, who had been marked with dark magic, created gathering of terrorists whose loyalty had been purchased through fear and mutual complicity in crimes that made normal social relationships impossible. Their reverence for Voldemort was based not on love or respect, but on recognition of power that could destroy them as easily as it could reward them, creating organizational structure that was simultaneously efficient and inherently unstable. The duel that followed between Harry and Voldemort was unequal contest between experienced adult wizard whose magical abilities had been enhanced by decades of dark arts study and 14-year-old boy whose education had never prepared him for combat against opponents who acknowledged no moral limitations. The priori incantatem effect that saved Harry's life was accident of wand compatibility rather than planned rescue, but it provided exactly the opportunity needed for escape from situation that should have been invariably fatal. The echoes of Voldemort's victims that emerged from their connected wands included Harry's parents, whose spiritual presence provided both comfort and motivation during the most terrifying moments of his young life. Their encouragement gave him strength to maintain the spell connection long enough for tactical advantage to shift in his favor, demonstrating that love could transcend death to provide protection that no conventional magic could duplicate. Cedric's echo was particularly poignant, the murdered boy's spirit asking only that his body be returned to his parents so that they might mourn properly and understand that his death had not been meaningless abandonment, but sacrifice in service of larger purposes. The request revealed character that death had not diminished, loyalty that extended beyond personal survival to encompass responsibility toward family members who deserved truth about his fate. Harry's escape with Cedric's body was triumph of loyalty over survival instinct, his refusal to abandon his fellow champion demonstrating exactly the qualities that made him suitable for roles requiring moral courage under impossible circumstances. The portkey return to Hogwarts delivered him to safety, but also to responsibilities that his experience in the graveyard had created, knowledge about returning evil that must be shared, despite its terrible implications. The revelation of Barty Crouch Jr.'s deception was devastating confirmation that Hogwarts security had been compromised at the highest levels. That trusted faculty member, whose paranoia had seemed excessive, was actually enemy agent, whose year-long manipulation had delivered student directly to Voldemort. The discovery destroyed comfortable assumptions about institutional safety, while revealing sophistication of enemy planning that exceeded anything previous experience had suggested. Albus's failure to detect the impersonation despite months of close collaboration with the false Moody was perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire conspiracy, suggesting that even his enhanced magical perceptions could be fooled by sufficiently sophisticated deception. The implications were staggering. If enemies could infiltrate Hogwarts at will, then no magical institution could be considered secure against forces whose capabilities transcended conventional understanding. The Veritaserum interrogation of the captured Death Eater revealed details about Voldemort's return and future plans, but it also confirmed that the tournament had been an elaborate trap designed specifically to deliver Harry to location where the resurrection ritual could be completed. Every aspect of the competition had been manipulated to ensure his participation and survival, until the crucial moment when his blood was needed for magical purposes that transformed him from target to unwilling contributor. The Ministry's refusal to acknowledge Voldemort's return, despite overwhelming evidence, reflected institutional cowardice that preferred comfortable denial to acknowledgement of threats that would require difficult responses and personal sacrifice from officials whose positions depended upon maintaining public confidence. Cornelius Fudge's determination to suppress Harry's testimony was political calculation that subordinated public safety to electoral considerations. The emotional trauma that Harry suffered from witnessing Cedric's murder and experiencing Voldemort's resurrection was profound and lasting, creating psychological wounds that would affect his behavior and relationships throughout the remaining years of his education. The guilt he felt over Cedric's death was irrational but powerful, evidence of moral sensitivity that made him suitable for roles requiring genuine concern for others' welfare rather than merely strategic calculation. Cedric Diggory's death was not merely tragic loss of promising young life, but strategic catastrophe that demonstrated the inadequacy of conventional magical education for preparing students to face enemies whose methods transcended normal categories of conflict and competition. His murder revealed that participation in events designed as academic contests could have consequences as final as any military engagement, transforming school activities into extensions of warfare that no institution should have permitted. The precedent established by the tournament's corruption, that international competitions could be manipulated by enemy agents for purposes that endangered participants while serving strategic objectives unknown to legitimate authorities, would influence magical cooperation for generations to come. The trust between institutions that had been built over centuries was shattered by revelations about how easily security could be compromised when enemies possessed sufficient patience and resources. The lessons learned from the tournament's tragic conclusion would shape both individual character development and institutional policy changes, but they came at costs that could never be justified by any strategic advantage they might have provided. The boy who returned from the graveyard was forever changed by experiences that no education should have encompassed, while the community that had celebrated his selection as champion was forced to confront realities about the nature of evil that comfortable peacetime assumptions had allowed them to ignore. The transformation of academic competition into battlefield was complete, establishing patterns that would define magical education for the remainder of Harry's time at Hogwarts and beyond. The children who had cheered for champions, competing for glory, would soon find themselves preparing for conflicts where the stakes were not cups and recognition, but survival itself, their innocence sacrificed on altars of necessity that their teachers had constructed through choices that prioritized strategic objectives over the welfare of those entrusted to their care. The summer of 1995 descended upon Privet Drive like a suffocating blanket, trapping Harry Potter in a prison of suburban normalcy that felt more confining than any dungeon cell could have been. The Dementors that had attacked him and Dudley in Little Whinging's underpass were merely the beginning of an isolation so complete and deliberate that it seemed designed to break his spirit before more sophisticated tortures could be applied. In the sweltering heat of his small bedroom, surrounded by the Dursleys' determined ignorance and the Ministry's bureaucratic persecution, Harry discovered that abandonment by those who claimed to protect him could be more devastating than any curse his enemies might devise. The silence from the magical world was not accidental neglect but calculated cruelty, orchestrated by Albus Dumbledore with the same methodical precision that had characterized his manipulation of previous crises. The boy who had witnessed Voldemort's return and carried news of terror renewed was being systematically isolated from every source of comfort and support that might have helped him process the trauma that consumed his waking hours and poisoned his dreams with visions of green light and maniacal laughter that echoed through corridors of memory. The letters that should have arrived daily from friends who understood his situation were intercepted before they could reach him, their expressions of concern and loyalty filtered away by protections that treated emotional support as dangerous contamination rather than essential healing. Hermione's carefully researched accounts of historical precedents for recent events, Ron's rambling descriptions of Quidditch matches and family news, even Hagrid's awkward attempts at comfort, all were deemed too risky for someone whose psychological state was considered secondary to larger strategic considerations. The Order of the Phoenix had been reformed in response to Voldemort's return, but Harry's exclusion from their activities was total and absolute, as if the boy whose blood had been used to restore the Dark Lord's physical form was somehow less qualified to understand the threats that his own experiences had revealed. The meetings at Grimmauld Place proceeded without any input from the only person who had witnessed the resurrection ritual, whose insights might have provided crucial intelligence about enemy capabilities and immediate intentions. Sirius Black's imprisonment within his family's ancestral home was cruel irony that paralleled Harry's confinement with the Dursleys, two souls trapped by circumstances that their protector claimed were necessary for their safety, while destroying their sanity through enforced isolation from everything that made their lives meaningful. The man who should have been Harry's guardian was reduced to bitter observer of events that affected his godson's welfare, his opinions dismissed by colleagues who treated his emotional investment as disqualifying bias rather than legitimate concern. The cleaning of Grimmauld Place provided Sirius with activities that were simultaneously necessary and torturous, clearing away centuries of accumulated dark arts artifacts, while surrounded by reminders of family heritage that had shaped his character through rebellion against everything the house represented. The portrait of his mother that screamed obscenities whenever disturbed served as perfect metaphor for psychological damage that could never be completely silenced, only temporarily suppressed through constant vigilance and careful avoidance of triggering circumstances. Kreacher's presence in the house was additional source of torment, the ancient house elf's loyalty to black family traditions, creating constant conflict with his current master's determination to support causes that contradicted everything his ancestors had believed. The creature's muttered insults and deliberate sabotage of cleaning efforts reflected broader tensions within magical society about blood purity and social hierarchies that the war would eventually force everyone to confront. The children who visited Grimmauld Place during the summer experienced freedom and excitement that contrasted cruelly with Harry's continuing imprisonment, their participation in Order activities, highlighting his exclusion while demonstrating that age was not the determining factor in who was considered capable of handling dangerous knowledge. Ron and Hermione's presence at headquarters while Harry remained at Privet Drive sent clear message about whose welfare was considered expendable when strategic considerations demanded sacrifice. The advance guard that eventually retrieved Harry from the Dursleys was theatrical gesture designed to demonstrate organizational competence while concealing the months of deliberate neglect that had preceded this dramatic rescue. The multiple decoys and elaborate security measures were impressive display of magical coordination, but they could not disguise the reality that Harry's suffering had been allowed to continue far longer than any emergency could justify. The revelation that he was being watched constantly while simultaneously being denied all meaningful contact with the magical world was particularly devastating, confirming that his isolation was not protective necessity, but psychological manipulation designed to increase his dependence on authorities whose judgment he was not permitted to question. The knowledge that Order members had been observing his deteriorating mental state without offering assistance destroyed whatever trust might have survived the months of abandonment. Molly Weasley's fierce protection of her children from Order activities while accepting Harry's exposure to dangers that exceeded anything they might face revealed unconscious double standard that treated the boy who lived as resource rather than child deserving of the same care that she lavished on her biological offspring. Her maternal instincts, which were genuine and powerful when applied to her own family, did not extend to someone whose value was measured primarily by his utility in conflicts that he had never chosen to join. The boggart in the writing desk at Grimmauld Place took the form of her children's corpses when it encountered Molly's deepest fears, but its failure to include Harry among the family members whose deaths she dreaded revealed emotional distance that she might not have acknowledged consciously. The boy who had saved her daughter's life and protected her youngest son was still outsider whose welfare was secondary to her primary loyalties and obligations. The trial at the Ministry for Harry's use of underage magic was judicial persecution that violated every principle of proportional response, while serving political objectives that had nothing to do with maintaining reasonable standards of magical law enforcement. The charges were technically valid but morally bankrupt, applying regulations designed for preventing frivolous magic use to life-threatening emergencies that demanded immediate defensive action regardless of legal niceties. Cornelius Fudge's determination to discredit Harry through legal proceedings reflected deeper institutional failure to acknowledge threats that comfortable denial was more appealing than difficult preparation for renewed conflict. The minister's political survival depended upon maintaining public confidence in his leadership, making acknowledgement of Voldemort's return tantamount to admission of incompetence that would destroy his career and legacy. The Wizengamot members who participated in Harry's trial were mostly political appointees whose understanding of magical law was secondary to their loyalty to current power structures, making them ideal instruments for persecution, disguised as judicial process. Their willingness to convict a minor for protecting himself and his cousin from Dementor attack revealed moral bankruptcy that extended far beyond individual corruption to encompass systemic failure of institutions that should have protected rather than persecuted those who served public welfare. Albus's dramatic appearance at the trial was perfectly timed intervention that demonstrated his continuing ability to manipulate legal proceedings while maintaining appearance of respect for institutional authority. His testimony provided both factual defense and political pressure that made conviction impossible without consequences that even Fudge was unwilling to accept. But his assistance came only after allowing Harry to experience terror that served no purpose beyond psychological conditioning. The acquittal was legal victory that felt like personal defeat, confirming Harry's growing understanding that his value to adult authorities was measured primarily by his usefulness rather than his inherent worth as human being deserving of protection and care. The relief he should have felt was overwhelmed by recognition that his treatment throughout the summer had been deliberate cruelty disguised as necessary sacrifice for the greater good. Mrs. Figg's revelation as Squib, who had been monitoring his activities for years, was final betrayal that destroyed any remaining illusions about privacy or autonomy during his childhood years with the Dursleys. The knowledge that every moment of abuse and neglect had been observed by someone with connections to the magical world made his suffering feel like performance rather than genuine misfortune, entertainment for adults who found his pain educational or strategically valuable. The return to Hogwarts should have provided relief from the isolation and persecution that had characterized his summer, but instead it brought new forms of torment as classmates and teachers who should have supported him instead treated his accounts of Voldemort's return as symptoms of attention-seeking behavior or psychological instability. The comfortable assumption that the war was over made truth-telling dangerous for those whose investment in denial exceeded their commitment to facing difficult realities. Dolores Umbridge's appointment as defense against the dark arts professor was bureaucratic coup that placed Ministry Spy in position to monitor and control educational content, while ensuring that students received no practical training in defending themselves against threats that official policy refused to acknowledge. Her presence transformed Hogwarts from sanctuary of learning into extension of political persecution that reached into every classroom and corridor. The educational decrees that followed Umbridge's arrival were systematic dismantling of academic freedom and institutional autonomy, each new regulation tightening governmental control, while eliminating sources of information and training that might prepare students for conflicts that political expediency demanded they remain ignorant about. The transformation of education into indoctrination was gradual but inexorable, making resistance difficult to organize and dangerous to attempt. Harry's detention sessions with Umbridge were torture, disguised as discipline, the blood quill that carved words into his flesh, serving as permanent reminder that speaking truth could have consequences that extended far beyond social disapproval or academic penalties. The phrase, "I must not tell lies" became scarred testimony to institutional commitment, to suppressing information that contradicted official narratives, regardless of its accuracy or importance. The formation of Dumbledore's army was an act of educational rebellion that provided students with training their official curriculum deliberately withheld. But it also created additional risks for participants whose families could face retaliation from ministry officials who viewed unauthorized magical education as a threat to governmental authority. The secret meetings in the Room of Requirement were simultaneously necessary preparation and dangerous conspiracy, their discovery carrying consequences that extended far beyond school disciplinary measures. Cho Chang's participation in the defense group was complicated by grief over Cedric Diggory's death and confusion about Harry's role in events that had claimed someone she had cared deeply about. Her emotional investment in understanding what had happened at the tournament's conclusion created relationship dynamics that were simultaneously healing and destructive, as shared trauma became foundation for connection that neither participant was psychologically prepared to manage successfully. The vision of Arthur Weasley's attack in the Department of Mysteries was Harry's first direct experience of his mental connection to Voldemort, providing intelligence that saved lives while revealing vulnerability that could be exploited by enemies who understood the nature of the magical bond between them. The knowledge that his mind was not entirely his own was terrifying recognition that his most private thoughts and feelings might be accessible to the very enemy he was being trained to oppose. The occlumency lessons that Severus Snape was ordered to provide represented Albus's recognition that Harry's mental defenses required strengthening, but the instruction was doomed from the beginning by personal animosity that made effective teacher-student relationships impossible. Snape's memories of humiliation at James Potter's hands created emotional barriers that prevented him from providing guidance that required trust and mutual respect to be successful. The lessons themselves were more psychological torture than educational opportunity, as Snape used legitimate training exercises to inflict pain and humiliation while satisfying personal vendettas that had been festering for decades. His invasion of Harry's private memories was violation that destroyed any possibility of cooperation while reinforcing patterns of mistrust that served no one's interests except those who benefited from division among their private enemies. Harry's glimpse of Snape's worst memory was accidental discovery that revealed his father's capacity for cruelty while destroying comfortable assumptions about inherited moral character and the relationship between victims and perpetrators of abuse. The knowledge that James Potter had been capable of humiliating someone weaker than himself created psychological crisis that challenged Harry's understanding of his own identity and potential for similar behavior. The decision to discontinue occlumency lessons was mutual abandonment that left Harry vulnerable to mental intrusion, while relieving Snape of responsibility for protecting someone whose resemblance to his childhood tormentor made successful instruction emotionally impossible. The failure of these sessions was predictable from their beginning, but their termination ensured that Harry would remain susceptible to manipulation through the very mental connection that made him valuable as early warning system for Voldemort's activities. The vision of Sirius being tortured in the Department of Mysteries was either genuine intelligence or deliberate deception, but Harry's response was inevitable given his emotional investment in his godfather's welfare and his desperate need to take meaningful action after months of enforced passivity. The rescue mission that followed was an act of heroic rebellion against authorities who had demonstrated no concern for protecting people Harry cared about from consequences of their strategic decisions. The Order members who accompanied Harry to the Ministry were mostly his fellow students, their participation reflecting both loyalty to friend and recognition that adult authorities had failed to provide adequate protection for people whose welfare should have been their primary responsibility. The battle that erupted in the Department of Mysteries was fought largely by teenagers whose magical education had never prepared them for combat against adult Death Eaters, whose experience and ruthlessness exceeded anything classroom instruction could have provided. Luna Lovegood's matter-of-fact approach to dangerous situations provided steadying influence during combat that tested everyone's courage and magical abilities to their absolute limits. Her acceptance of extraordinary circumstances as merely another aspect of reality's strangeness helped maintain group cohesion when fear and confusion might otherwise have led to panic that would have made effective resistance impossible. Neville Longbottom's transformation from anxious student to determined fighter was catalyzed by understanding that the Death Eaters they battled were same terrorists who had tortured his parents into permanent insanity. His personal stakes in the conflict provided motivation that transcended academic training, demonstrating how emotional investment could compensate for technical disadvantages when courage was combined with adequate magical ability. Ginny Weasley's participation in the battle reflected her understanding that her previous possession by Voldemort's memory gave her insights into enemy psychology that might prove crucial for successful resistance. Her experience with dark magic provided preparation that her brothers lacked, making her more effective combatant despite her younger age and theoretically inferior magical education. The prophecy that Voldemort sought was ancient prediction whose contents were known only to those who had witnessed its original utterance, but its existence had shaped strategic decisions on both sides of the conflict, without either faction understanding completely what advantages its possession might provide. The struggle to control access to information that might not justify the costs of obtaining it reflected broader patterns of conflict where symbolic victories became more important than practical achievements. Sirius Black's death was a direct result of Harry's manipulation into believing that rescue mission was necessary to save someone whose welfare had been deliberately endangered by authorities who claimed to protect him while using him as bait for traps, whose success required his emotional investment in outcomes he was not permitted to influence. The grief that consumed Harry was genuine, but also strategically useful for psychological conditioning that would make future sacrifices seem like natural extensions of existing patterns rather than unprecedented demands. The duel between Sirius and Bellatrix Lestrange was confrontation between family members whose different choices about blood purity and social hierarchy had created irreconcilable opposition, their personal conflict reflecting broader civil war that was tearing wizarding society apart along lines that had been developing for generations. His death was not mere casualty, but symbolic victory for forces that viewed blood traitors as deserving punishment regardless of their individual qualities or contributions to community welfare. The veil that claimed Sirius was ancient magical artifact whose function remained mysterious but whose finality was absolute, creating boundary between life and death that could not be crossed by any known magic or desperate love. Harry's inability to follow his godfather through that portal was merciful prevention of suicide disguised as rescue attempt, but it also represented ultimate powerlessness in face of forces that exceeded human understanding or control. Albus's arrival at the Ministry battle was precisely timed intervention that prevented complete disaster, while allowing sufficient tragedy to occur for educational purposes that served his long-term strategic objectives. His duel with Voldemort demonstrated capabilities that casual observers had never suspected, revealing that previous restraint had been choice rather than limitation when circumstances demanded direct action. The possession that Voldemort attempted during the battle's aftermath was invasion of Harry's mind and soul that was repelled not by magical defenses, but by emotional experiences that the Dark Lord could not comprehend or tolerate. The love that Harry felt for his fallen godfather was weapon that Voldemort could not counter because his own psychological damage made such feelings literally inconceivable to someone whose understanding of human motivation was limited to power, fear, and hatred. The revelation of the prophecy's contents was information that Harry had earned through suffering but had never requested, knowledge that transformed his understanding of his relationship with Voldemort, while burdening him with responsibilities that no adolescent should have been asked to accept. The prediction that neither could live while the other survived was death sentence disguised as destiny, reducing complex human conflict to simple mathematics of mutual annihilation. Albus's explanation of his decision to isolate Harry was confession that acknowledged tactical error while revealing strategic thinking that treated individual suffering as acceptable cost for collective benefit. His admission that love had made him reluctant to burden Harry with difficult truths was incomplete apology that concealed deeper patterns of manipulation while claiming emotional investment that his actions had consistently contradicted. The guilt that consumed Harry over Sirius's death was cultivated rather than discouraged, his self-blame serving psychological purposes that would make future sacrifices seem like atonement for past failures, rather than new demands from authorities whose judgment he was not permitted to question. The responsibility he accepted for outcomes that had been orchestrated by adults who controlled information and resources he had never possessed was education in accepting blame for consequences of others' decisions. The summer that followed would bring new forms of isolation and manipulation as the wizarding world finally acknowledged Voldemort's return, while maintaining patterns of denying Harry agency or autonomy in conflicts that centered on his unique connection to their greatest enemy. The boy who had lost his godfather to rescue mission based on false information would discover that grief was just another tool in the arsenal of those who claimed to protect him while using him as weapon in wars he had never chosen to fight. The lessons learned from this cruel education would shape his understanding of duty and sacrifice in ways that served strategic objectives while destroying whatever remained of childhood innocence or trust in adult wisdom. The pattern established through deliberate abandonment, followed by insufficient rescue, would be repeated until Harry accepted that his value to others was measured primarily by his willingness to die when circumstances demanded ultimate sacrifice for purposes that only his manipulators fully understood. The summer of 1996 brought with it the suffocating weight of acknowledged darkness, as the wizarding world finally abandoned comfortable denial in favor of fearful preparation for conflicts that promised to eclipse anything in living memory. Albus Dumbledore's private study had become a war room where ancient tomes shared space with intelligence reports, their leather bindings cracked from age, bearing witness to research that pushed the boundaries of what any single mind should attempt to comprehend. The secret that Tom Riddle had shared with Horace Slughorn decades earlier was finally yielding its terrible fruit, revealing methods of cheating death that transformed theoretical horror into practical nightmare, requiring immediate response. The discovery of Horcrux magic had been years in the making, piecing together fragments of evidence from Tom's school years with observations of his impossible survival and return to physical form. The diary that had possessed Ginny Weasley, the ring of Marvolo Gaunt that now sat powerless in Albus's desk drawer, the inexplicable persistence of Voldemort's consciousness despite the destruction of his body, all were components of a puzzle whose solution revealed the most abhorrent magical practice ever conceived by human imagination. But understanding the enemy's methods was only the beginning of challenges that would test every assumption about the relationship between individual sacrifice and collective welfare. Each Horcrux represented not merely fragment of soul, but fortress of evil that required specific approaches for destruction. Magical techniques that pushed beyond conventional spellwork into territories where the boundaries between healing and harm, protection and corruption became dangerously unclear. The ring that had nearly claimed Albus's life during the previous summer was testament to Voldemort's sophistication in protecting his immortality anchors. Its cursed defenses designed to kill anyone who attempted to interfere with magic that violated the fundamental order of life and death. The withered hand that resulted from his moment of weakness was permanent reminder that even the most knowledgeable wizards could be undone by emotions that overcame rational caution when confronted with temptations that promised to heal. Wounds that rational magic could never touch. The resurrection stone embedded within the ring had been irresistible lure for someone whose guilt over Ariana's death had festered for decades without relief. Its promise of reunion with lost loved ones, creating psychological vulnerability that Voldemort had anticipated and exploited with characteristic cruelty. The moment when Albus had slipped the ring onto his finger was surrender to desires that he had spent his entire adult life suppressing. Emotional need, overwhelming intellectual understanding of the prices that such magic always demanded from those foolish enough to seek easy answers to questions that had no solutions. Severus Snape's intervention had saved his life, but could not undo the fundamental damage that the curse had inflicted. Magical corruption that was slowly spreading through his system with the inexorable progress of poison in a bloodstream. The treatments that slowed its advance were temporary measures that purchased months rather than years, creating deadline that gave urgency to research that had already consumed every spare moment of his waking hours. The irony was bitter and inescapable. His attempt to resurrect his sister had doomed him to death that could have been avoided if emotional need had not overcome the analytical caution that had characterized every other aspect of his approach to dangerous magic. The guilt that had motivated his reckless behavior was now compounded by understanding that his impending death would leave crucial tasks unfinished, responsibilities that could not be transferred intact to others who lacked his specific knowledge and experience. Harry's education in the true nature of their enemy had to be accelerated despite the psychological risks of exposing someone so young to information that had disturbed adults with decades of experience in confronting human evil. The pensive lessons that occupied their private sessions were carefully curated presentations of Tom Riddle's development from damaged child to monster beyond redemption, each memory selected to provide insight into enemy psychology while building Harry's understanding of the choices that had created the threat they faced. The memory of Tom's first meeting with Albus at Wool's orphanage was particularly painful. Its revelation of missed opportunities and failed interventions, serving as confession of guilt that no amount of subsequent heroism could expiate. The signs of dangerous development had been clear to anyone trained in recognizing them, but the decision to treat Tom as ordinary student rather than extraordinary threat had allowed potential for evil to flourish without the constraints that intensive supervision might have provided. Horace Slughorn's memory of his conversation with young Tom about Horcruxes was the crucial intelligence that had been missing from their understanding of Voldemort's methods, but obtaining it required manipulation that exploited the old professor's vanity and guilt in ways that felt uncomfortably similar to Tom's own techniques for extracting information from unwilling sources. The knowledge was essential, but the methods required to obtain it raised questions about the relationship between necessary ends and acceptable means that had no comfortable answers. The revelation that Voldemort had likely created multiple Horcruxes was devastating confirmation that their enemy's preparations for immortality extended far beyond single backup plan, requiring systematic campaign to locate and destroy artifacts whose identities and locations remained frustratingly unknown. The mathematical horror of Soul divided into 7 pieces suggested psychological damage so profound that conventional understanding of human nature provided no framework for comprehending what Tom had become. The locket of Salazar Slytherin that they sought in the seaside cave was pursuit based on inference rather than certainty, educated guesswork that placed both teacher and student at risk for prize that might prove to be decoy rather than genuine Horcrux. But the investigation was necessary regardless of its outcome, as each potential lead eliminated was step closer to understanding the full scope of defenses that protected their enemy from final death. The cave itself was masterwork of protective magic that revealed Tom's development from talented student into master of dark arts, whose sophistication exceeded anything in Albus's considerable experience. The entrance required payment in blood, symbolic and literal demonstration that access would be purchased through suffering while establishing psychological atmosphere of violation and sacrifice that would intensify with each layer of defense they penetrated. The boat that carried them across the underground lake was deceptively simple transportation that concealed restrictions designed to prevent multiple intruders from approaching the island simultaneously. The magic that detected additional passengers was subtle enough to be overlooked by casual inspection, but absolute in its enforcement of limitations that would make group assault impossible while isolating individual attackers for more efficient elimination. The inferi that dwelt beneath the lake's surface were Tom's answer to intruders who might attempt to bypass his other protections through aquatic approach. Animated corpses whose resistance to conventional magic made them nearly invulnerable to spells that would dispatch living opponents. Their presence transformed the cave from mere obstacle course into killing ground where mistakes would have consequences that extended far beyond failure to achieve objectives. The basin that contained the potion protecting the locket was perhaps the most cruel aspect of the entire defensive system, requiring whoever sought the Horcrux to consume liquid that would induce psychological torment while weakening magical defenses to levels that made survival increasingly unlikely. The enchantment that prevented removal of the potion through any means except drinking was an elegant solution to the problem of creating obstacle that could not be bypassed through clever alternatives to intended methods. Albus's decision to drink the potion himself was acceptance of responsibility that reflected his understanding that the mission's success was more important than his personal survival. But it was also recognition that Harry's psychological stability was too valuable to be risked for single Horcrux, whose destruction might not justify the trauma that consuming the potion would inflict. The calculation was utilitarian and heartless, treating his own welfare as expendable while protecting resources that would be essential for future battles. The visions that the potion induced were tailored specifically to his psychological vulnerabilities, forcing him to relive Ariana's death, while experiencing variations of that trauma, where different choices might have led to different outcomes. The magic reached into his deepest guilt and regret to create suffering that was simultaneously artificial and absolutely real, psychological torture that was more devastating than any physical pain that conventional curses could inflict. Harry's role during this ordeal was to force continuation of consumption despite Albus's pleas to stop, his determination to complete the mission requiring him to ignore the suffering of someone he cared about, while maintaining focus on objectives that transcended individual welfare. The experience was education in the kind of ruthless calculation that would be necessary for his eventual confrontation with Voldemort, though the lessons came at psychological cost that could never be fully measured or repaired. The locket they retrieved was masterfully crafted decoy whose presence in the cave suggested that someone else had already succeeded in locating and removing the genuine Horcrux, their investigation representing months of dangerous preparation for prize that had been claimed by unknown predecessor, whose identity and motivations remained mysterious. The note signed by R.A.B. was a tantalizing clue that provided no immediate answers while confirming that their understanding of the situation was incomplete and possibly fundamentally flawed. The flight from the cave was desperate retreat, as Albus's weakened condition made normal magical transportation impossible while Inferi emerged from the lake in numbers that suggested Tom's defenses were designed to ensure that intruders who succeeded in reaching the locket would never survive to benefit from their achievement. The fiend fire that cleared their escape route was magic so dangerous that its use within confined space risked killing them along with their pursuers. Desperate measure that reflected the narrow margin between success and catastrophe. The return to Hogsmeade should have provided opportunity for recovery and planning, but instead brought news that Death Eaters had infiltrated Hogwarts during their absence, taking advantage of security gaps that the mission had created to launch assault on school that had been considered impregnable. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, suggesting either betrayal from within their ranks or surveillance capabilities that exceeded their understanding of enemy intelligence methods. Harry's invisibility cloak had concealed him from Death Eater detection, but not from moral complicity in events that unfolded during his enforced inaction. His position as hidden observer, creating psychological burden that was simultaneously necessary for mission success and devastating for someone whose instincts demanded direct intervention when friends were in danger. The knowledge that his presence might have changed outcomes if circumstances had been different would haunt him regardless of rational understanding about tactical necessities. The battle that raged through Hogwarts corridors was preview of larger conflict to come, Death Eaters and Order members engaging in combat that would have been unthinkable within school grounds if not for escalation that had made traditional boundaries meaningless. The transformation of educational institution into battlefield was complete, establishing precedent that would make future attacks on civilian targets seem like natural extension of existing hostilities rather than unprecedented escalation. Bill Weasley's mauling by Fenrir Greyback was tragedy that demonstrated the enemy's willingness to use creatures whose savagery exceeded normal military engagement, introducing elements of bestial cruelty that violated conventional understanding of acceptable combat methods. The permanent disfigurement he suffered was a reminder that some wounds could not be healed completely regardless of magical intervention, psychological and physical scars that would affect his relationships and self-perception for the remainder of his life. The confrontation on the astronomy tower was culmination of months of planning and manipulation, multiple parties converging with different objectives while believing they understood the situation's true nature. Albus's apparent vulnerability was simultaneously genuine weakness and strategic positioning, his physical deterioration providing cover for psychological preparation that would make his death serve larger purposes than his continued survival could achieve. Draco Malfoy's assignment to kill Albus was mission designed for failure. Voldemort's recognition that the boy lacked both capability and genuine commitment to murder, making the task perfect demonstration of how Death Eater families were being consumed by loyalty that demanded sacrifices they were psychologically unprepared to make. The teenager's obvious terror and reluctance revealed that coercion rather than conviction was driving his participation in activities that contradicted his fundamental character. The vanishing cabinet that provided Death Eater access to Hogwarts was fruit of months of careful repair work that demonstrated Draco's ingenuity while serving Voldemort's larger strategy of infiltrating locations that conventional assault could never penetrate. The paired artifacts represented security vulnerability that had existed undetected for years, hidden in plain sight among magical devices whose true nature was obscured by their mundane appearances. Severus Snape's arrival at the crucial moment was precisely timed intervention that had been planned through their private conversations, his presence ensuring that Albus's death would occur according to their carefully negotiated terms, rather than through methods that Death Eaters might prefer. The unbreakable vow that bound him to protect Draco required completion of mission that the boy could not accomplish, creating obligation that could only be fulfilled through actions that would destroy his reputation while preserving his soul. The killing curse that ended Albus's life was simultaneously murder and mercy, ending suffering that would have intensified over subsequent months, while ensuring that his death served strategic purposes rather than merely representing defeat by enemy action. The green light that claimed him was fired by someone whose loyalty had never wavered despite years of playing roles that required apparent betrayal of everything they both valued. Harry's forced witness of these events was education in powerlessness that would prove essential for understanding the limitations of individual agency. When confronted with forces that operated according to principles that transcended personal preferences or moral qualms, his inability to intervene was strategic necessity, disguised as circumstantial constraint, ensuring that he would survive to continue mission while learning that heroism sometimes required accepting outcomes that every instinct demanded he prevent. The funeral that followed was ceremony of mourning disguised as strategic planning session, gathering of allies whose grief was genuine, but whose presence served larger purposes of demonstrating unity while providing cover for intelligence sharing that could not be conducted through normal channels. The white tomb that contained Albus's remains was monument to sacrifice, but also symbol of continuing resistance, his death marking transition rather than ending of struggle against forces that threatened everything the magical world claimed to value. The will that distributed his possessions was final lesson in manipulation, disguised as generosity, each bequest carefully chosen to provide tools and knowledge that recipients would need for tasks they had not yet accepted. The Deluminator that went to Ron, the Tales of Beedle the Bard that went to Hermione, the Golden Snitch that remembered Harry's touch, all were components of larger plan that would guide their actions, even after its architect was no longer present to provide direct instruction. But perhaps the most significant aspect of his legacy was the incomplete nature of information he had shared. Crucial details withheld until recipients would be psychologically prepared to accept responsibilities that knowledge would create. Harry's understanding of his own nature as accidental Horcrux was revelation that could not be shared until circumstances demanded willing self-sacrifice. Educational program that required precise timing to achieve desired psychological effects. The mission to locate and destroy remaining Horcruxes was inheritance that came without instruction manual, treasure hunt whose clues were scattered across decades of careful observation and theoretical analysis. The task would require not just magical ability but psychological insight into enemy thinking that could only be developed through intimate study of Tom Riddle's character and motivations, understanding that demanded temporary adoption of perspectives that threatened to corrupt those who pursued them too thoroughly. The trio that would continue the hunt was carefully selected team, whose individual strengths complemented each other's weaknesses, while their collective loyalty provided psychological anchor against forces that would test every assumption about friendship and duty. Their education had been preparation for challenges that normal magical instruction could never have encompassed, practical experience with moral complexity that would prove essential when circumstances demanded choices that had no clearly right answers. The safe houses and resources that had been prepared for their use were a network of support that extended beyond grave, proof that death need not end responsibility for those whose commitment transcended individual survival. The protections and provisions that would sustain them during their quest were final demonstration of care that had been expressed through manipulation, but was nonetheless genuine in its concern for their welfare and success. The knowledge that Voldemort's defeat was possible but not certain was burden that could not be shared with broader magical community whose morale depended upon faith in eventual victory, rather than understanding of odds that favored enemy whose preparations had been decades in the Boxos making. The hope that sustained resistance was built upon foundations that might prove inadequate when tested by realities that optimism could not overcome through mere determination. The boy who had been shaped through years of careful manipulation was now responsible for completing mission, whose success would determine whether his mentor's sacrifices had been meaningful investments or tragic miscalculations. The education he had received was proving its worth through tests that would challenge every lesson while demanding application of principles that academic instruction could never have provided through theoretical study alone. The death that had ended one phase of the war had begun another. Transition from adult leadership to student initiative that reflected both confidence in preparation and recognition that some battles could only be fought by those whose psychological characteristics made them uniquely suitable for tasks that others could not attempt without being destroyed by moral compromises that victory would require. The legacy of manipulation disguised as mentorship would continue to guide actions long after its architect had paid the ultimate price for knowledge that had come too late to prevent the tragedies his earlier failures had made inevitable. The October night of 1981, when Severus Snape fell to his knees before Albus Dumbledore, was not merely a moment of desperate supplication, but the forging of chains that would bind his soul for the remainder of his life, transforming grief and guilt into instruments of servitude that no amount of subsequent heroism could ever fully break. The man who had carried Lily Evans's lifeless body from the wreckage of her home in Godric's Hollow was already dead in every way that mattered, his heart stopped by the sight of green eyes that would never again look upon him with anything approaching forgiveness for the role his information had played in her destruction. The prophecy that Severus had overheard at the Hog's Head Inn had seemed like valuable intelligence when he delivered it to his master, another piece in the complex puzzle of Voldemort's campaign against those who opposed his vision of magical supremacy. The partial information he possessed had been sufficient to identify the threat without revealing the crucial details that might have provided protection, making him an unwitting instrument of tragedy that would consume everything he had ever valued, while leaving him alive to experience every moment of loss and regret. Albus's response to his plea for Lily's protection had been characteristically complex, mixing genuine compassion with strategic calculation that recognized opportunity disguised as human suffering. The grief-stricken Death Eater who begged for chance to atone for his betrayal was precisely the kind of asset that the war's changing dynamics would require, someone whose intimate knowledge of enemy psychology and methods could be purchased through emotional manipulation that exploited love rather than fear or ambition. The promise to protect Lily Potter was made in good faith, but with understanding that protection might prove impossible given the forces already in motion, magical and mundane factors that no individual wizard could control, regardless of his power or determination. But the commitment created psychological bond that would survive even the failure of its primary objective, transforming Severus's devotion to living woman into service to her memory that could be directed toward purposes that served larger strategic goals. The aftermath of Halloween night brought confirmation that promises made with sincere intention could be shattered by circumstances beyond anyone's ability to prevent, but it also revealed that guilt could be more powerful than gratitude for shaping behavior when properly cultivated and directed. Severus's rage at Albus's failure to save Lily was matched by recognition that his own actions had been primary cause of her death, creating psychological prison where anger and self-recrimination reinforced each other in endless cycle of suffering. The offer of employment at Hogwarts was presented as opportunity for fresh start and meaningful contribution to magical education, but its deeper purpose was to place valuable asset in position where his activities could be monitored, while his expertise could be utilized for purposes that he might not have accepted if their full scope had been revealed. The appointment as Potions Master provided legitimate cover for research and communication that would prove essential as Voldemort's influence began to rebuild itself through networks that conventional intelligence gathering could never penetrate. The years between Voldemort's first defeat and his return were a period of apparent peace that concealed continuing struggle for souls and loyalties that would determine outcome of future conflict. Severus's position at Hogwarts made him valuable observer of young minds that might be shaped toward light or darkness depending on influences they encountered during their formative years. His reports providing intelligence about families whose allegiances remained questionable despite public demonstrations of support for victorious causes. His treatment of students was deliberately harsh, calculated to identify those who possessed strength of character necessary for resisting pressure while eliminating weaklings whose inability to endure adversity made them unsuitable for roles that would require absolute dedication, regardless of personal cost. The fear he inspired was a tool for measuring courage rather than mere sadism, though the distinction was meaningless to children who experienced his methods without understanding their deeper purposes. The favoritism he showed towards Slytherin House was strategic necessity that maintained credibility with former Death Eater families, while providing him with access to information about pure blood society that isolation would have made impossible to obtain. His apparent bias was performance that required constant attention to detail, every gesture and word calculated to reinforce persona that concealed true loyalties, while serving intelligence gathering objectives that could not be achieved through conventional methods. The arrival of Harry Potter at Hogwarts was a moment that Severus had been preparing for during a decade of enforced waiting. Opportunity to honor Lily's memory through protection of her son, while confronting daily reminder of his own failures, and the husband whose existence had made his love impossible to fulfill. The boy's resemblance to James Potter was torture disguised as duty, every interaction requiring suppression of emotions that ranged from protective instinct to murderous rage. The decision to maintain facade of hostility toward Harry was strategic choice that provided cover for protection that could not be offered openly, without destroying credibility that years of careful cultivation had created. His interventions on the boy's behalf were subtle enough to avoid detection while sufficient to prevent disasters that might have claimed life that Lily's sacrifice had preserved, balancing competing loyalties that created impossible psychological tensions. The Philosopher's Stone incident provided perfect demonstration of how protection could be disguised as persecution. Severus's apparent attempt to curse Harry during Quidditch match actually representing counterjinx that prevented Quirrell's more sophisticated attack from succeeding. His presence at every match thereafter was insurance against repetition of such attempts, vigilance that appeared to be malevolent interest but served purposes that only Albus fully understood. The revelation of Quirrell's possession was confirmation that Voldemort's return was inevitable rather than merely possible, intelligence that required immediate preparation for conflict that would test every relationship and loyalty that peace had allowed to develop. Severus's recognition of his former master's magical signature was accompanied by understanding that his years of relative safety were ending, that choices made long ago would soon demand payment in forms that might exceed his ability to survive. The gradual strengthening of Darkmark's connection was physical manifestation of Voldemort's increasing power, magical bond that could not be broken through any known means, while it provided direct communication channel that made deception increasingly dangerous for anyone attempting to serve competing masters. The burning sensation that intensified with each sign of the Dark Lord's return was promise of summons that would eventually come regardless of Severus's personal preferences or competing obligations. His preparation for resuming role as double agent required psychological conditioning that would allow him to maintain facade of loyalty while serving purposes that would result in destruction of cause he was supposed to support. The compartmentalization necessary for such deception was achieved through occlumency techniques that created mental barriers between different aspects of his identity, protection that came at cost of emotional integration that healthy personalities required for normal functioning. The memories of Lily that sustained his motivation for continued service were carefully preserved in forms that could withstand legilimency probe while concealing details that might compromise his position or reveal true depth of commitment to her son's welfare. The love that provided strength for impossible choices was simultaneously source of vulnerability that enemies could exploit if they understood its significance and intensity. The return to Voldemort's service was reunion with nightmare that had never truly ended. Resumption of role that required participation in activities that violated every moral principle he claimed to value while maintaining pretense of enthusiasm that could convince observers whose suspicions would mean immediate death. The other Death Eaters who welcomed him back were colleagues whose friendship was based on shared complicity in atrocities that normal human relationships could never survive. The intelligence he provided to Voldemort was a mixture of truth and deception so sophisticated that even experienced legilimens could not distinguish between genuine information and carefully crafted lies designed to serve strategic objectives while maintaining appearance of absolute loyalty. His value as spy depended upon ability to betray enemies sufficiently to maintain credibility while protecting allies through misdirection that required constant attention to detail and consequences. The missions he was assigned tested every aspect of his commitment to Albus's cause, while providing opportunities to gather intelligence that could save lives if transmitted carefully through channels that would not compromise his position. The balance between maintaining cover and serving larger purposes was maintained through calculations that treated individual suffering as acceptable cost for strategic advantage that might prevent greater disasters. His interaction with other Order members was complicated by knowledge that some viewed him with suspicion that was entirely justified given his history and current activities, their distrust reflecting reasonable caution about someone whose loyalties had changed once and might change again if circumstances created sufficient pressure. The isolation he experienced within both organizations was price of serving competing masters whose mutual hatred made true belonging impossible. The teaching position that provided his official identity was maintained through performance that required constant vigilance against lapses that might reveal emotions or sympathies that contradicted carefully constructed persona. His students learned potions from someone whose expertise was genuine, but whose methods were shaped by need to appear consistent with reputation that had been built through years of strategic cruelty, disguised as educational rigor. Harry's 5th year brought intensification of pressures that had been building since Voldemort's return became undeniable fact rather than comfortable denial. The occlumency lessons that Albus ordered him to provide were torture for both teacher and student, their personal animosity making effective instruction nearly impossible, while emotional stakes involved made failure potentially catastrophic for larger war effort. The invasion of Harry's memories during these sessions was simultaneously necessary training, exercise, and personal violation that satisfied urges for revenge that Severus had been suppressing for years while serving strategic purposes that required understanding of the boy's psychological vulnerabilities and strengths. The knowledge he gained was used for protection rather than harm, but the methods employed were indistinguishable from those that enemies might use for darker purposes. The revelation of his worst memory was humiliation that destroyed whatever remained of privacy about experiences that had shaped his character, while providing Harry with information about his father that complicated comfortable assumptions about inherited moral superiority. The exposure was devastating but also liberating, ending pretense that his hatred was purely professional while acknowledging personal dimensions that had always been present but carefully concealed. The termination of occlumency lessons was mutual recognition that some relationships were too damaged by history and circumstance to permit cooperation that required trust and emotional openness. The failure of instruction was predictable from its beginning, but its consequences would prove catastrophic when Harry's unprotected mind became pathway for manipulation that led directly to disaster that might have been prevented through different approaches to essential preparation. The battle at the Department of Mysteries was culmination of psychological manipulation that had been months in development. Voldemort's use of Harry's connection to lure him into a trap that served multiple strategic purposes, while testing loyalties and capabilities of Order members whose commitment would be essential for larger conflict ahead. Severus's role in these events was a complex mixture of intelligence gathering and damage limitation. His advanced knowledge, allowing him to position resources for rescue mission, while maintaining appearance of ignorance about plans that his true loyalties would have demanded he prevent. Sirius Black's death was tragedy that accomplished enemy objectives while providing Order with martyrdom that could be used for motivational purposes. Complex outcome that reflected moral ambiguities of conflict, where individual losses served strategic purposes that transcended personal relationships. Severus's lack of grief over his childhood tormentor's fate was balanced by recognition that Harry's emotional devastation would create psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies who understood how love could be transformed into weapon against those who experienced it. The revelation of prophecy's contents was intelligence that both sides had been seeking, information that transformed Harry from merely significant target into existential threat, whose elimination became Voldemort's primary objective, rather than simply one goal among many competing priorities. The knowledge that neither could live while the other survived was death sentence disguised as destiny, reducing complex conflict to simple mathematics of mutual annihilation that left no room for compromise or negotiation. Albus's increasing frailty during the search for Horcruxes was obvious to someone trained in recognizing signs of magical corruption, but the knowledge that his time was limited was kept secret from Harry, whose psychological preparation for eventual leadership role required gradual assumption of responsibility, rather than sudden transition that might overwhelm capabilities that were still developing. Severus's awareness of approaching deadline created urgency that influenced every decision about resource allocation and strategic priorities. The unbreakable vow that bound him to protect Draco Malfoy was oath that satisfied multiple competing obligations while ensuring that mission assigned to the boy would be completed regardless of his personal capability or commitment. The promise to fulfill Draco's task if necessary was acceptance of responsibility that would destroy his reputation while preserving his soul. Calculated sacrifice that served larger purposes than individual welfare could justify through normal moral reasoning. The night on the astronomy tower was culmination of months of careful planning between teacher and student who had become co-conspirators in deception that would fool everyone except each other. Albus's apparent vulnerability was strategic positioning that would make his death serve purposes that continued survival could never achieve, while Severus's role as executioner was final service that would complete transformation from Death Eater to double agent to something approaching martyr for causes that he had learned to value through suffering rather than inspiration. The killing curse that ended Albus's life was simultaneously murder and mercy, ending pain that would have intensified over coming months while ensuring that death occurred according to their mutual agreement, rather than through methods that enemies might prefer. The spell was fired by someone whose loyalty had never wavered, despite years of playing roles that required apparent betrayal of everything they both considered sacred. Ultimate demonstration of trust between conspirators whose friendship had been built through shared commitment to purposes that transcended personal comfort or reputation. The flight from Hogwarts after the tower confrontation was escape that had been planned as carefully as the events that made it necessary. Route that would return him to Voldemort's service, with credibility enhanced by successful completion of mission that other Death Eaters had considered impossible. His value to the Dark Lord was increased by demonstration of capability, while his true purpose was served through elimination of leader, whose death had been inevitable, but whose timing and circumstances could be controlled through their collaboration. The year that followed was a period of hiding and service that tested every aspect of commitment that had sustained him through decades of impossible choices. His protection of students at Hogwarts balanced against need to maintain credibility with Death Eaters, whose suspicions would mean death if aroused by actions that seemed inconsistent with proclaimed loyalties. The position as headmaster was reward for faithful service, but also burden that required constant attention to balancing competing demands that could never be fully satisfied. The sword of Gryffindor that he delivered to Harry was gift that completed circle of service that had begun with promise to protect Lily Potter, assistance provided through methods that maintained his cover, while ensuring that tools necessary for Horcrux destruction would reach those capable of using them effectively. The Patronus that guided Harry to the weapon was manifestation of love that had motivated every sacrifice, while providing proof that some emotions could survive any amount of suffering or moral compromise. His final confrontation with Voldemort was meeting that had been inevitable since the moment he chose to serve competing masters, exposure of deception that could not be maintained indefinitely regardless of skill or dedication involved in its construction. The explanation of Elder Wand's ownership was revelation that demonstrated how thoroughly the Dark Lord misunderstood forces that motivated human behavior, his assumption that power was transferable through violence, reflecting psychological limitations that would ultimately contribute to his defeat. The memories that he gave to Harry in his final moments were confession and instruction combined. Decades of careful observation and strategic thinking distilled into information that would provide both emotional understanding and practical guidance for completing mission that he could not finish personally. The tears that carried these memories were manifestation of grief that had been suppressed but never eliminated. Recognition that some wounds could never heal completely, regardless of time or attempts at atonement. The revelation of his love for Lily Potter was admission that transformed every aspect of his relationship with her son, while providing explanation for behavior that had seemed motivated by cruelty, but was actually expression of protection, too complex for normal understanding. The Doe Patronus that had been his secret guardian was symbol of affection that death had not diminished. Magical manifestation of emotions that sustained heroism through suffering that would have broken lesser souls. The final message that Harry must die was information that completed educational program that had been conducted through manipulation, disguised as hostility, preparation for willing self-sacrifice, that could only be achieved through understanding of stakes that transcended individual survival. The knowledge was devastating but necessary. Truth that transformed victory from simple defeat of enemy into acceptance of personal annihilation for purposes that served community welfare above individual desires. The man who died in the Shrieking Shack was a hero whose heroism could never be publicly acknowledged. Martyr, whose martyrdom served purposes that required his reputation to remain permanently stained by actions that had been necessary for maintaining position that allowed him to serve causes he had learned to value more than life itself. His sacrifice was complete and unrecognized, service that exemplified principle, that true nobility was measured not by public recognition, but by willingness to accept whatever costs duty demanded, regardless of personal consequences or desire for vindication. The legacy he left was protection purchased through decades of suffering, education provided through methods that appeared cruel, but were motivated by love that had been refined through pain into something approaching perfect dedication to welfare of those he had been entrusted to guard. The boy who survived to complete their mutual mission was living testament to effectiveness of sacrifice that had transformed guilt into redemption through service, that demonstrated how completely personal desires could be subordinated to purposes that served larger good than individual happiness could ever provide. The terrible arithmetic of war had been building toward its inevitable conclusion for 17 years. Each careful manipulation and strategic sacrifice designed to culminate in a moment that would demand the ultimate price from someone who had never been asked if he was willing to pay it. Harry Potter walked through the Forbidden Forest on that final night with the acceptance of someone who had finally understood the true nature of his education, the patient cultivation of moral character that would make willing self-sacrifice seem like natural choice rather than impossible demand from authorities who had shaped his entire existence around this singular moment of surrender. The revelation contained within Severus Snape's memories had been devastating in its completeness, stripping away every comfortable illusion about his survival and future, to reveal the mathematical certainty that his death was not merely probable outcome, but essential requirement for victory over forces that had claimed too many lives already. The knowledge that he was himself a Horcrux, that fragment of Voldemort's soul, had been residing within him since that Halloween night when his mother's love had deflected the killing curse, transformed his entire understanding of identity while explaining the connection that had tormented him throughout his years at Hogwarts. But even more shattering than learning about his own nature was the recognition of how completely his life had been orchestrated by someone whose manipulation had been disguised as protection, whose care had been expressed through systematic preparation for eventual sacrifice that would serve purposes larger than individual survival. Every lesson about love and courage, every demonstration of loyalty and friendship, every experience that had shaped his moral development, all had been components of educational program designed to produce someone capable of choosing death when circumstances demanded such choice for collective welfare. Albus Dumbledore's greatest achievement was not his defeat of Grindelwald or his contributions to magical theory, but his successful creation of someone who would walk willingly toward destruction when walking away would condemn entire communities to suffering that his continued existence made inevitable. The boy who had been raised by relatives who despised him, who had learned about magical world through dramatic rescue that emphasized his special nature, who had been tested repeatedly through challenges that built confidence while teaching lessons about sacrifice. Every aspect of his development had been calculated to produce this moment of acceptance. The Dursleys' cruelty had been an essential component of psychological conditioning that made magical worlds seem like sanctuary worth dying to protect, their contempt and neglect creating emotional vacuum that could be filled by relationships with people whose welfare would become more important than personal survival. The years of abuse and isolation had not been unfortunate circumstances that caring adults had been unable to prevent, but necessary preparation that made subsequent bonds feel precious enough to justify any sacrifice for their preservation. His arrival at Hogwarts had been carefully orchestrated introduction to community whose acceptance transformed him from unwanted burden into beloved protector, social connections that created emotional investments that could be leveraged when circumstances demanded choices between personal safety and communal welfare. The friendships he formed with Ron and Hermione were genuine, but also strategically valuable. Relationships that provided both emotional support and psychological pressure that would influence behavior when individual preferences conflicted with collective needs. The tests he faced during his school years had been progressive education in accepting responsibility for outcomes that affected others, each challenge designed to build confidence while demonstrating that heroism required willingness to risk everything for people who might not even understand what they were being protected from. The philosopher's stone that nearly cost his life, the basilisk that almost claimed him in the Chamber of Secrets, the dementors that attacked him during his third year. Every danger had been learning experience that built toward eventual understanding that some threats could only be defeated through self-sacrifice. The Tri-Wizard tournament had been particularly cruel manipulation, forced participation that demonstrated how external forces could compel involvement in conflicts that he had never chosen, while teaching lessons about competition and survival that would prove relevant when facing final challenge where victory meant death rather than glory. The maze that led to Voldemort's resurrection had been preview of psychological complexity that would characterize his final choice, situation where every option carried terrible costs, but inaction guaranteed outcomes worse than any individual suffering. His fifth year had provided education in isolation and abandonment that prepared him psychologically for walking alone toward death, understanding that protection sometimes required protectors to act without support or approval from those they were trying to save. The silence that had tormented him during that summer was rehearsal for final solitude that would characterize his approach to the Forbidden Forest, acceptance that some responsibilities could not be shared regardless of how much emotional support might be desired. The loss of Sirius Black had been a devastating lesson in the reality that people he loved could die as consequence of his choices, that survival carried moral weight that transcended personal preferences when others' welfare was affected by decisions he made. The guilt that consumed him over his godfather's death was cultivated rather than discouraged. Emotional burden that would make his own death seem like appropriate atonement for losses that his existence had caused. The Horcrux hunt had been final stage of preparation that provided both practical knowledge and psychological conditioning necessary for confronting truth about his own nature while building relationships that would make his sacrifice meaningful rather than merely tragic. The months spent with Ron and Hermione in isolation from broader magical community had deepened bonds that transformed abstract concepts about friendship into concrete understanding of love that transcended individual survival when choices had to be made between competing loyalties. The locket that had tormented Ron during their quest was preview of psychological warfare that Voldemort's soul fragment had been conducting against Harry throughout his life, influence so subtle and persistent that it had become part of his identity rather than external pressure that could be recognized and resisted. The realization that his most private thoughts and emotions had been contaminated by enemy presence was violation that made death seem like purification rather than loss. The knowledge that he would survive the encounter with Voldemort was withheld until after his willingness to die had been demonstrated beyond question. Strategic omission that ensured his choice would be genuinely selfless rather than calculated gamble based on incomplete understanding of magical principles involved. The possibility of survival was hope that could not be offered without corrupting motivations that had to be pure for the sacrifice to achieve its intended magical and psychological effects. His mother's protection, renewed through Voldemort's use of his blood in resurrection ritual, was safeguard that had been understood by Albus but could not be guaranteed with certainty sufficient to justify revealing its existence to someone whose decision had to be made without comfort of believing that death might not be permanent. The magic was complex and unprecedented. Theoretical possibility, rather than assured outcome that could be relied upon for planning purposes. The walk through the Forbidden Forest was pilgrimage that completed 17 years of careful preparation, each step taking him further from community that had shaped his understanding of duty while moving closer to confrontation that would test every lesson about love and sacrifice that his education had attempted to provide. The resurrection stone that he discovered in the snitch provided opportunity for final conversation with family members whose deaths had motivated his commitment to protecting others from similar losses. His parents' spirits were manifestation of love that death had not diminished, their presence providing comfort that made approaching end seem like reunion rather than termination, while reinforcing understanding that some bonds transcended physical existence to create obligations that survived individual mortality. Their encouragement gave him strength to continue when every instinct demanded retreat. Demonstration that courage was inherited quality that could be activated through proper emotional preparation. Sirius's spirit was reminder of consequences that his survival had already created. Guilt that could only be resolved through acceptance of responsibility that extended beyond personal preferences to encompass welfare of everyone whose lives had been affected by his choices. The man who had died protecting him was now asking him to complete mission that their relationship had made necessary, request that transformed obligation into gift that could be offered willingly rather than demanded through external pressure. Remus Lupin's presence provided final lesson in adult responsibility, understanding that maturity meant making choices that served future generations rather than immediate gratification, while accepting that wisdom sometimes demanded actions that contradicted emotional preferences. His former teacher's spirit represented educational tradition that had shaped Harry's development, knowledge passed from one generation to the next, through examples of sacrifice that made learning possible. The clearing where Voldemort waited was destination that had been inevitable since the night when Lily Potter's love had created magical protection that would eventually require renewal through willing acceptance of death by someone whose moral development had been carefully guided toward this moment of choice. The Dark Lord's surprise at Harry's voluntary appearance was evidence of psychological limitations that prevented him from understanding motivations that transcended self-interest and personal survival. The gathering of Death Eaters who witnessed the encounter was audience for demonstration of principles that their ideology claimed were impossible, practical proof that love could motivate behavior that pure selfishness could never achieve, while providing example of heroism that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and moral possibility. Their presence transformed private sacrifice into public education about values that their movement had tried to destroy through terror and intimidation. Hagrid's captivity was additional psychological pressure designed to increase Harry's emotional investment in outcomes, while providing witness whose testimony would carry special weight due to his relationship with the boy he was. Watching approach certain death, the half-giant's grief was genuine expression of loss, while serving strategic purpose of demonstrating impact that Harry's choice would have on community that had come to depend upon his protection. The killing curse that Voldemort cast was spell-powered by hatred and confidence in victory, magical force that should have been absolutely fatal but encountered protection, that the Dark Lord's limited understanding of love had prevented him from recognizing or preparing for. The green light that struck Harry was simultaneously death and rebirth. ending that created beginning while demonstrating that some forms of magic transcended conventional categories of success and failure. The liminal space where Harry's consciousness retreated was neither death nor life, but opportunity for final choice about whether return was desirable or possible, given knowledge that he now possessed about his true nature and the costs that survival would impose upon everyone he cared about. The conversation with Albus's spirit was reunion with mentor whose guidance had shaped every aspect of his development while providing explanation for choices that had seemed cruel but were motivated by love that expressed itself through strategic necessity. The revelation that his survival was possible rather than certain was gift that came without obligation, information that allowed choice to be made with complete understanding, while ensuring that whatever decision resulted would be genuinely free rather than coerced through ignorance about available options. The knowledge transformed his situation from inevitable tragedy into opportunity for heroism that could be embraced willingly rather than endured as unavoidable fate. His decision to return to life was acceptance of responsibility that extended beyond individual survival to encompass leadership role that his unique experience and moral development had prepared him to fulfill. The choice was motivated not by desire for continued existence, but by understanding that others needed protection, that only someone with his particular combination of knowledge and character could provide effectively. The body that he inhabited upon returning was changed by experience of voluntary death, purified through sacrifice that had eliminated Voldemort's soul fragment, while strengthening magical and psychological qualities that would be necessary for completing mission that his temporary death had begun rather than ended. The connection that had tormented him throughout his life was severed, leaving him free to act according to his own moral compass, rather than contaminated impulses that enemy influence had created. The final confrontation with Voldemort was battle between someone who had accepted death and returned stronger for the experience, and someone whose entire existence was built upon denial of mortality that made him vulnerable to forces he could not comprehend or counter. The mathematical certainty that one of them had to die was resolved through Harry's understanding that survival was less important than ensuring that evil did not triumph through his failure to complete responsibilities that his education had prepared him to accept. The protection that his sacrifice had created for everyone at Hogwarts was magical field that prevented Voldemort's spells from causing permanent harm. Demonstration that love could serve as shield for entire communities when expressed through willing self-sacrifice by someone whose moral development had been adequate for such ultimate expression of care. The magic was ancient and powerful, principle that had been demonstrated throughout history, but rarely achieved through preparation as systematic and comprehensive as Harry's education had provided. The revelation of Elder Wand's true loyalty was final lesson in understanding that power could not be claimed through violence, but had to be earned through demonstration of qualities that transcended mere magical ability or strategic cunning. The wand's refusal to harm its true master was mechanical application of magical principles that reflected moral realities about the relationship between authority and worthiness that Voldemort's philosophy could never acknowledge or accommodate. The death that finally claimed the Dark Lord was not murder but natural consequence of choices that had isolated him from every form of love and connection that gave life meaning while protecting him from death that he feared more than any other possible outcome. His destruction was suicide disguised as battle, self-annihilation that resulted from psychological limitations that made survival impossible when confronted with evidence that his fundamental assumptions about human nature were completely wrong. The boy who survived to rebuild magical world that war had nearly destroyed was fundamentally different from child who had entered Hogwarts 7 years earlier, transformed through experiences that had tested every aspect of character, while building understanding of duty and sacrifice that would guide leadership through challenges that peace would bring. His education was complete, paid for through costs that no individual should have been asked to bear, but which circumstances had made necessary for survival of community, that depended upon his willingness to accept responsibilities that others could not fulfill. The legacy of his mentor's manipulation was complex inheritance that included both gifts and burdens, knowledge that had been essential for victory, but understanding that had come through methods that challenged comfortable assumptions about the relationship between love and manipulation, protection and exploitation, education and psychological conditioning. The man who had shaped his development had achieved objectives that served collective welfare while employing techniques that treated individual autonomy as secondary consideration to strategic necessities that transcended personal preferences. The question of whether such methods could be justified by their results was a philosophical challenge that would influence every decision Harry made as adult leader. Understanding that some situations might require choices that contradicted moral instincts while serving purposes that could not be achieved through approaches that prioritized individual rights over collective survival. The lesson was harsh but essential. Recognition that heroism sometimes demanded becoming something that heroes would normally oppose. The children who would grow up in world that his sacrifice had preserved would never fully understand costs that had been paid for their safety, but their ignorance was itself part of gift that had been purchased through suffering that enabled innocence to survive in an environment where knowledge would have been corruption. The peace that followed war was built upon foundation of choices that peace could never acknowledge without destroying psychological conditions that made peaceful existence possible. The manipulation that had shaped his entire life was revealed as expression of love so profound that it accepted any moral compromise necessary to ensure survival of someone whose welfare had become more important than personal integrity or reputation of those who served his protection. The methods were questionable, but motivations were pure. Dedication that transformed utilitarian calculation into something approaching sacred duty that justified whatever sacrifices might be demanded from servants who understood their role in larger purpose. And so the boy who had been raised as lamb for slaughter discovered that even lambs could choose the nature of their sacrifice. That willing acceptance could transform victimhood into victory while demonstrating principles that no amount of manipulation could have created if foundation of genuine love had not existed to support structure of moral education that circumstances had demanded. The 17 years of preparation had achieved their purpose, producing someone capable of choices that saved world while proving that some forms of manipulation could serve love rather than exploitation when guided by wisdom that understood relationship between individual sacrifice and collective redemption. And so we reach the end of our journey through the shadowed corridors of a great man's conscience, where every choice carried the weight of worlds and every mistake echoed through generations. Albus Dumbledore was neither saint nor monster, but something far more human and tragic a soul who understood that sometimes love demands the unthinkable, that protection requires pain, and that saving the world might cost everything we hold sacred. His mistakes were not born of malice, but of impossible mathematics, the terrible calculus of war where every decision carried prices too heavy for any heart to bear. In his failures, we see not weakness, but the crushing weight of responsibility that comes with power, the burden of those who must choose who lives and who dies, who suffers and who finds peace. Sleep now, gentle dreamer, and let these tales remind you that heroism is not the absence of error, but the willingness to bear the consequences of necessary choices. In your dreams, may you find the peace that eluded even the greatest wizard of his age, the rest that comes only to those unburdened by the weight of worlds.